Part 4, Rocket Science and Near Ruin, 2002 to 2008. Chapter 31. The Falcon 1 Development, Iterative Failure and Learning. The fireball was visible from 3 miles away. It rose in the specific, terrible beauty that high-energy propellant combustion produces when it occurs outside the controlled environment of a combustion chamber, orange at its core, white at its edges, expanding upward and outward with the indifferent grandeur of a physical process that does not distinguish between a controlled burn and a catastrophic one. The Falcon 1 had been on the launch pad at Omelik Island for months of preparation, transported across the Pacific to this remote atoll in the Marshall Islands because the Federal Aviation Administration's launch licensing requirements and the proximity of California's populated coastline made the El Segundo warehouse an acceptable place to build a rocket and an unacceptable place to fly one. The island was a former military installation, a speck of coral and scrub vegetation in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, chosen because its remoteness made it legally and logistically viable, and because the trajectory from Omelik to low Earth orbit passed over nothing that mattered if something went wrong. Something had gone wrong. Musk stood at the launch control station watching the telemetry data collapse into the particular flat lines and error codes that mean the vehicle no longer exists in the form in which it was intended to exist. And the people around him, engineers who had given years of their lives to the hardware that was now a debris field on and around the launch pad, were absorbing the information in the various ways that human beings absorb information that is simultaneously technical and devastating. Some were silent. Some were already pulling up data streams, reaching for the engineering reflex of analysis, because analysis is more bearable than loss. Some were looking at Musk. He looked at the data. Then he looked at the team. Then he said, with the specific, compressed calm of someone who has decided that the appropriate response to catastrophic failure is forward motion rather than grief, that they were going to find the cause, fix it, and fly again. He did not say when. He did not need to. The road to Omelik had taken 4 years and consumed a quantity of capital, engineering labor, and human endurance that no project plan written in the El Segundo warehouse in 2002 had accurately predicted. The Falcon 1, a name chosen partly for its avian speed and partly as a nod to the Millennium Falcon of the Star Wars films that Musk had grown up with, a detail that revealed something about the interior life of the man behind the engineering documents, had been designed to be the simplest useful orbital rocket that SpaceX could build. 2 stages. 1 Merlin engine in the first stage. 1 Kestrel in the second. A payload capacity of approximately 600 kilograms to low Earth orbit. Cheap by aerospace standards. Responsive by aerospace standards. Everything by aerospace standards that the existing market lacked. The gap between designed to be and actually is in rocket engineering is a gap of a specific and humbling character, and SpaceX's journey through it between 2002 and 2006 was a tutorial in the unforgiving nature of a technology that punishes incompleteness with extinction. The years of Falcon 1's development unfolded against a backdrop that was, in its political and cultural texture, both encouraging and indifferent to what was happening on Omelik Island. The early 2000s were a period of genuine ferment in the question of commercial spaceflight. Not mainstream ferment, not the kind that registered in the daily consciousness of most Americans, but the specific energetic activity of a community that had concluded that the era of government-exclusive access to orbit was ending and was organizing itself around the implications of that conclusion. Burt Rutan had won the Ansari X Prize in October of 2004, flying Spaceship One to the edge of space twice within 2 weeks, in a demonstration that private capital and private ingenuity could reach altitudes that had previously been the exclusive domain of national space programs. The achievement had been celebrated by the space community with the intensity of people who had been waiting for it for a long time, and it had produced, in the broader culture, a brief flare of interest in private spaceflight that then subsided into the ordinary noise of a news cycle that had other priorities. George W. Bush had announced in January of 2004 the Vision for Space Exploration, a policy directive that aimed to return Americans to the Moon by 2020 and eventually send them to Mars, and that included in its fine print an acknowledgement that commercial providers might have a role to play in the transportation architecture that would make those goals achievable. It was the first significant signal from a presidential administration that NASA's monopoly on American access to space was not a permanent feature of the national landscape, and Musk had read it with the attention of someone for whom policy documents are engineering constraints rather than political abstractions. NASA, however, was not SpaceX's customer yet, and SpaceX was not yet the kind of company that NASA could seriously consider as a partner. It was a startup in a warehouse building its first rocket, and the distance between that description and the description of a company capable of serving a government space program was, in 2004 and 2005, still enormous. The development of the Merlin engine, which was the technical heart of the Falcon 1 program, and the component whose performance would ultimately determine whether SpaceX's first principles cost analysis translated into actual hardware, was a process that consumed Mueller and his propulsion team in a way that the word consuming only partially captures. They were not refining an existing design. They were creating a new one, a regeneratively cooled liquid oxygen and kerosene engine with a specific impulse and a thrust-to-weight ratio that the first principles analysis had defined as necessary, and that the engineering team had to make real from materials and manufacturing processes that had to be invented, sourced, tested, and refined in a sequence that the schedule said should take months and that the work insisted on taking longer. The testing program at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, where SpaceX had arranged to use existing test infrastructure rather than building its own, a practical concession to cost and timeline that was itself a first principles decision, produced data that was sometimes encouraging and sometimes alarming and always informative, which is the best that can be said about rocket engine testing. It is always informative, frequently in ways you would have preferred not to learn. The core conflict of the Falcon 1 development period was not ultimately technical. It was financial, and it was existential, and it was structured by the specific arithmetic of a company that had a fixed pool of capital and an iterative development process whose timeline was governed not by the schedule but by the hardware, by the combustion instabilities that revealed themselves only under full power test conditions, by the structural failures that appeared only at the vibration frequencies of actual flight, by the corrosion that developed in the liquid oxygen feed system during the weeks of pad stand time that the remote Pacific launch site required. Each problem consumed time. Each unit of time consumed money. The money was Musk's money, not in the abstract sense of founder equity, but in the literal sense that he had written the checks from his own PayPal proceeds, and the checks were finite, and the rate at which they were being drawn against was a number that Musk tracked with the specific wakeful attention of someone who understands that the distance between his current bank balance and zero is also the distance between his mission and its termination. There is an episode from the lead-up to the first launch attempt that has been recounted by members of the early SpaceX team with the vividness that comes from experiences that are simultaneously technical crises and character revelations. The Falcon 1 had been transported to Omelek Island and erected on the launch pad, and the countdown had proceeded through its preparatory phases to the point of engine ignition, the moment that years of analysis and testing and argument and iteration had been building toward. And the engine had ignited, and the vehicle had begun to rise, and then, 25 seconds into the flight, the fuel line had caught fire, and the rocket had fallen back onto the pad, and the first attempt had ended in the specific silence of a thing that has stopped transmitting. The cause, when the post-mortem analysis identified it, was an aluminum nut in the fuel line, a component that had corroded during the extended pad time at Omelek, a failure mode that had not been adequately anticipated in the design review, because the extended pad time had not been adequately anticipated in the mission planning, because the logistical realities of operating a launch facility on a remote Pacific atoll had not been fully modeled in the El Segundo warehouse. Musk received the preliminary failure analysis at his desk and read it with the focused attention of someone who is searching not for someone to blame, but for the precise location of the gap between his model and reality. The gap, in this case, was in the corrosion specification, a materials decision that had been made reasonably given the information available at the time, and that the information available afterward indicated had been wrong. He called a meeting. He asked the engineers to explain the failure mode completely. He asked what the fix required. He approved the fix and moved the schedule to the next launch attempt. He did not fire anyone. He did not rage. What several engineers who were present describe And what carries the quality of a revelation about Musk's character, under genuine pressure rather than ordinary pressure, is the sense that the failure had been absorbed as data rather than disaster. That somewhere in the processing of it, Musk had made a decision, not for the first time and not for the last time, that the appropriate response to a failure that was understandable was to understand it completely and then move. This was not the response of someone who did not feel the failure. It was the response of someone who had decided that feeling it was a private matter, and that the public expression of it was less useful than the engineering response to it. The relationship that most clearly illuminates the texture of SpaceX's development culture in this period, and that reveals something specific about Musk that the broader narrative sometimes obscures, is the one between Musk and his early engineering team collectively, understood less as a set of individual relationships and more as a culture that a single person had constructed through the specific combination of demands and freedoms he imposed. Gwynne Shotwell had joined SpaceX in 2002 as Vice President of Business Development, recruited from a career in the aerospace industry where she had demonstrated the specific combination of technical literacy and commercial acuity that the company needed to translate its engineering ambitions into paying customers. She was not a rocket engineer in the way that Mueller was a rocket engineer. She was something that SpaceX needed equally and differently. Someone who could stand in front of potential launch customers, many of whom were skeptical that a startup on an industrial block in El Segundo had any realistic prospect of delivering their payloads to orbit, and make the case for the company with the credibility that comes from genuinely believing it. Shotwell believed it. Her belief was not the credulous enthusiasm of someone who had been sold a vision without examining it. It was the considered conviction of someone who had looked at the engineering, had evaluated the team, had assessed the first principles framework against her knowledge of the industry's cost structure, and had concluded that the analysis was correct and the enterprise was serious. Her relationship with Musk during the Falcon 1 development period was one of productive complementarity. He pushed the technical program with a ferocity that required a counterpart who could manage the commercial relationships those technical programs were meant to serve, and she provided that counterpart with a steadiness that the volatile development timeline required. When the rocket failed, she was the one who made the calls to customers whose payloads had been on the vehicle, or who had been planning to be. She told them what had happened, what the cause analysis showed, and when the next attempt would be. She told them with the specific quality of honesty that distinguishes between spin and acknowledgement, not minimizing the failure, not performing confidence that the data did not support, but presenting the situation as it was and making the case, based on the engineering rather than the optimism, for why the next attempt would be different. The customers, for the most part, waited. This was partly because SpaceX's prices were still significantly below the alternatives, and partly because the alternatives were not always available at the volume the small satellite market needed. But it was also, in a way that is harder to quantify, because Shotwell's communication of the failure had the quality that trust requires, the quality of someone who tells you the hard thing directly and trusts you to handle it. SpaceX would attempt to launch the Falcon 1 3 times before it reached orbit, and each failure would add to the mounting financial pressure on a company whose founder had committed his personal fortune to an enterprise that was, by any external measure of progress, failing. The aerospace establishment watched each explosion with reactions that ranged from genuine sympathy for the engineering challenge to something more uncomfortable, a quiet confirmation of the belief that what Musk was attempting was not merely difficult, but presumptuous, the category error of a software entrepreneur who had mistaken the accessibility of his previous industries for a universal property of complex technical systems. The rocket equation was not a software problem. It did not iterate on user feedback. It did not improve through agile sprints and rapid deployment cycles. It improved through the specific, slow, expensive, and occasionally explosive process of building hardware, testing it against reality, and incorporating what reality taught, a process that the El Segundo team was learning at the precise rate that the physics and the budget permitted, which was a rate that the schedule had not predicted and that the bank account was struggling to sustain. The fourth launch attempt was being prepared with the knowledge, known to Musk and to the senior team if not widely discussed, that it was the last one the company could afford, that if the fourth rocket failed, the money would be gone, the company would be over, and the first principles analysis that had seemed so compelling on a plane ride home from Moscow would become a footnote in the history of ambitious ideas that did not survive their contact with the world. What no one on the team knew yet was that the fourth attempt would not be the only crisis approaching, that simultaneously across the continent in Michigan and California, the other company Musk had funded with his own fortune was arriving at its own appointment with financial extinction, and that the two disasters converging on the same man at the same moment would produce, before they resolved, the most dangerous passage of his life. Chapter 32. Kwajalein Atoll, the logistical challenge of the Pacific. The barge pitched in the chop, and the rocket did not care. It was secured to the deck with the kind of improvised rigging that aerospace engineers from established programs would have regarded with professional alarm. Not because it was unsafe, exactly, but because it had the quality of a solution invented by people who had encountered a problem that no existing procedure covered, and had decided, with the pragmatic confidence of a team that had been inventing procedures for 3 years, to invent another one. The Falcon 1, horizontal and shrouded, occupied most of the available deck space on the vessel that was carrying it from Kwaj, the name the SpaceX team had adopted for Kwajalein, with the familiarity of people who have been somewhere long enough to abbreviate it, to Omelik Island, 7 miles across the lagoon, where the launch pad waited in the specific suspended readiness of infrastructure that has been built at enormous expense and effort and is waiting for the thing it was built for. The Pacific swells were moderate by Pacific standards, which meant they were considerable by the standards of people who were responsible for the structural integrity of a vehicle that had taken 2 years to build, and would be asked in a matter of days to survive the acoustic and vibrational environment of a rocket engine at full thrust. The engineers on the barge watched the rocket and watched the water and ran the numbers in their heads the way engineers run numbers, not consciously exactly, but as a background process that never fully suspends, that is always checking the visible world against the model of what the visible world should look like if everything is proceeding correctly. Everything was proceeding approximately correctly, which was the best that could be said about most things at Kwajalein, and which was, by the standards the team had developed for acceptable risk, enough. The decision to launch from Kwajalein Atoll had not been made from preference. It had been made from necessity, which is the category into which most of SpaceX's significant decisions fell during this period. Not choices between good options, but navigations between constraints, each of which had been created by a regulatory, logistical, or financial reality that the El Segundo warehouse had not fully modeled when the company was incorporated, and that the team encountered one by one, with the grim regularity of problems that had been waiting patiently for someone to attempt what SpaceX was attempting. The Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Commercial Space Transportation regulated launch licenses in the United States, and the path to a license for an orbital launch vehicle from a continental American site was a process of documented complexity, environmental assessments, range safety analyses, trajectory studies, public comment periods, and the accumulated oversight of an agency that had been built to manage the interface between commercial ambition and public safety in a domain where the consequences of getting it wrong included debris fields and propellant clouds over populated areas. The process was not unreasonable. It was simply slow, and slowness in the vocabulary of SpaceX's burn rate was a synonym for expensive, and expensive in the context of a founder-funded startup with a fixed pool of capital was a synonym for dangerous. Kwajalein had offered a different path. The Reagan test site, operated by the Army on the atoll's main island, was an existing range facility with established safety infrastructure and a regulatory framework that, while still requiring FAA oversight, could be navigated more efficiently for a launch trajectory that passed over open ocean rather than the populated coastlines of California or Florida. The Army had reasons of its own to be interested in a relationship with a commercial launch provider. Reasons related to the Pentagon's growing awareness that its dependence on a small number of large incumbent contractors for access to space was a strategic vulnerability, and that the emergence of a lower-cost alternative was a development worth encouraging. The arrangement that resulted was not without its complications, but it was faster and cheaper than the continental alternatives, and fast and cheap were the metrics that governed every significant decision in the El Segundo warehouse. The year 2004, when SpaceX's teams began the sustained logistics operations that would support the Falcon 1 launch program from Kwajalein, was a year in which the Marshall Islands existed at a particular intersection of the global and the forgotten. The atoll had been the site of American nuclear testing in the late 1940s, and the legacy of that testing, the contamination, the displacement of indigenous populations, the decades of legal and political struggle over compensation and remediation, was still present in the landscape and in the conversations of the people who lived there, a reminder that the Pacific had been used as a test range for American ambitions before SpaceX arrived, and had not always emerged from the experience intact. Musk was aware of this history with the selective awareness of someone whose primary focus is on the work at hand. The geopolitical and human dimensions of the atoll's past registered, but they were not what organized his attention. What organized his attention was the 7 miles of water between Kwajalein and Amlek, and the problem of moving rockets, propellant, and a rotating team of engineers across that water, and sustaining them on an island whose infrastructure had been designed for military operations rather than commercial launch campaigns. Amlek Island was, in its physical description, modest in the way that only places that have been stripped of every non-essential feature can be modest. It was small, a few acres of coral and palm vegetation, and flat, and exposed to the trade winds that moved across the Pacific with the indifference of large systems to small obstacles. The launch pad that SpaceX had constructed on it was the most significant structure on the island. The living quarters for the team that would support launch operations were military surplus containers, modified for habitation with the same first principles frugality that governed the engineering of the rocket itself. There was no hotel. There was no restaurant. There was the pad and the containers and the water and the sky and the work. Getting anything to Amlek required a barge. Getting people to Amlek required a boat. Getting the rocket to Amlek required the barge and the improvised rigging and the moderate Pacific swells, and the background process of engineers running structural numbers while watching the horizon. Getting propellant to Amlek required a supply chain that began on the continental United States and passed through Kwajalein main island before reaching the 7-mile water crossing, a chain so logistically elaborate that the SpaceX team had, by necessity, become competent in a domain, remote operations logistics, that had not been listed in any of their job descriptions. The core conflict of the Kwajalein period was not the rocket. The rocket was the technical problem, and technical problems in Musk's cosmology were the tractable ones, problems that responded to intelligence and effort and iteration in the way that physical systems respond to correct engineering. The core conflict was the environment, the friction generated by the distance, the logistics, the isolation, and the sustained pressure of operating a complex technical program from a coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with a team that was simultaneously too small for the scope of the work and unable to be significantly larger because the budget did not permit it. The team that deployed to Kwajalein during the launch campaigns lived in a condition that defied easy categorization. It was not comfortable. The heat was constant, the humidity was considerable, and the entertainment options available after a 14-hour workday were limited to whatever the team had brought with them, and the company of people who had been living and working together at close quarters for long enough that they had developed the particular, compressed intimacy of people who share an extreme experience. But it was also, by the accounts of many who were there, genuinely extraordinary in a way that the ordinary conditions of employment rarely achieve. The sense of being at the specific point where a large ambition and a physical reality were meeting, of being one of the small number of people on Earth who were doing a specific thing, of having the kind of purpose that is rare enough to be recognizable when you are inside it. Musk traveled to Kwajalein for each launch attempt. This was not operationally necessary. The launch could be commanded from the control station on Kwajalein main island, and his physical presence on the atoll did not change the physics of the rocket. It was symbolically and practically necessary in a different sense. The team needed to see him there, needed the evidence that the person who was asking them to endure the conditions was willing to endure them too, that the sacrifice was shared rather than extracted. He arrived for the first launch campaign in early 2006, and the detail that several team members have preserved from his arrival is small but revealing. He walked the pad, as he always walked new hardware, with the focused attention of someone who is checking his mental model against the physical reality, looking for the gap between the design and the build, between the drawing and the thing. He asked questions that were specific enough to demonstrate preparation, and pointed enough to reveal that he was not merely verifying, but evaluating. He found a discrepancy, a fastener installation that did not match the specification, and addressed it not with anger but with the direct, non-negotiable clarity of someone who understood that the difference between a correct fastener and an incorrect one on a vehicle that would experience the acoustic environment of rocket ignition was not a cosmetic matter. The fastener was corrected. The detail was noted by the engineers present, not because it was unusual for Musk to notice such things, but because the noticing at Kwajalein in the heat after a 14-hour travel day carried a different weight than the same noticing in the El Segundo warehouse. It said something about the quality of attention he brought to the work that did not diminish with distance or discomfort, or the accumulated fatigue of years of building something that had not yet succeeded. The figure whose relationship with Musk most illuminates the Kwajalein period is Hans Königsmann, the German-born avionics engineer who had joined SpaceX in 2002 as one of the company's earliest technical hires and who bore primary responsibility for the flight software and avionics systems that would guide the Falcon 1 during its ascent. Königsmann was, in his professional temperament, a precise counterweight to the more operationally intense members of the team. Methodical, thorough, possessed of the German engineer's specific relationship to documentation and process, which valued completeness over speed in a way that sometimes created friction with the company's default setting of maximum velocity. At Kwajalein, the friction between thoroughness and speed took on a particular urgency because the remote location imposed costs on every delay that the El Segundo timeline had not captured. A scrubbed launch attempt meant another day of operations on the island, another day of propellant management, another day of the team operating in the heat and the humidity, another day of the financial clock running against a budget that had no slack. The pressure to launch when the vehicle was ready in all the ways the checklist defined readiness was constant and structural. Königsmann held his ground. When the avionics data said the system was not ready, he said the system was not ready. And he said it in the specific, patient, unambiguous way of someone who understood that the alternative to a scrub was the possibility of a failure that was not merely expensive, but informative in ways that a successful flight would not be. Meaning that a failure caused by launching before the system was ready was a less valuable failure than one caused by a system that had been given every possible advantage. Musk pushed. Königsmann pushed back. The dynamic between them, as described by people who observed it across multiple launch campaigns, was not comfortable and was not meant to be. It was the necessary tension between the person who needed the rocket to fly and the person who needed it to fly correctly. And the fact that both pressures were legitimate and both were unresolvable without the other made the tension not a problem to be eliminated, but a feature to be managed. The first launch attempt from Omlik, in March of 2006, ended in failure 25 seconds into the flight, when the fuel line corrosion that had been developing during the weeks of pad stand time, the specific failure mode that the Kwajalein logistics had created, and that no test at Stennis had anticipated, caused a fire that destroyed the vehicle and the pad and the small satellite payload it was carrying. The post-mortem was conducted with the thoroughness that SpaceX had developed as its response to failure. Every data point examined, every failure mode traced to its root cause, every lesson incorporated into the next design revision with the specific unsentimental efficiency of people who could not afford to learn the same lesson twice. The pad was rebuilt. The vehicle was redesigned. The team returned to Kwajalein for the second attempt, carrying with them the modifications that the first failure had required and the knowledge, which they did not discuss much, but which was present in the specific way that large facts are present without being articulated, that the money was finite and the attempts were numbered and the margin for learning was narrowing with each launch campaign that ended without reaching orbit. What they could not yet know, what Musk could not yet know, sitting in the launch control station on Kwajalein main island with the telemetry feeds open and the engineers around him and the Pacific horizon visible through the window, was that the second launch would also fail, and the third would also fail, and that by the time the fourth attempt was being prepared, the financial situation at SpaceX would have converged with the financial situation at Tesla into a single compound emergency of a magnitude that would require Musk to make decisions about his own resources and his own endurance that no first principles analysis could have prepared him for, because they were not engineering decisions. They were decisions about how much a person could spend of themselves before the spending became a subtraction from which recovery was no longer possible. And the answer, Musk was about to discover, was more than most people would ever need to know. Chapter 33. Flight 1. The 33-second disaster, 2006. The countdown reached 0 and the world held its breath, and for one perfect second everything worked. The Merlin engine ignited with the specific violent authority of a system that has been designed to release controlled energy at a rate that the human nervous system was not built to process calmly. A column of fire and acoustic energy that hit the launch pad deflector and spread outward in the manner of something that has been waiting under pressure for the permission to expand. The Falcon 1 lifted. It cleared the pad. It rose above Omelik Island with the clean, purposeful trajectory that 4 years of engineering had promised it would achieve. And in the launch control station on Kwajalein, 7 miles across the lagoon, the engineers watching the telemetry feeds and the tracking cameras experienced the specific, almost physical sensation of years of work becoming real in a way that drawings and simulations and engine tests had only approximated. Elon Musk watched the vehicle rise, and his face, by the accounts of people standing near him in those first seconds, held an expression that those who know him well describe as rare, something open in it, something that had not yet been armored by the need to process information and make decisions, something that was simply receiving the moment. He had been building toward this for 4 years. He had spent $100 million of his own money. He had recruited engineers away from established careers and asked them to work on an island in the Pacific for the privilege of attempting something that the aerospace establishment had told them, in various registers of directness, was not going to work. For one perfect second, it was working. Then, at 33 seconds after liftoff, the telemetry changed. The data streams that engineers read during a rocket flight have the quality of a vital signs monitor, a constant flow of numbers that are meaningful only in their deviation from expectation, and that a trained eye can parse in the fraction of a second it takes for the deviation to register. The numbers that appeared on the screens at the 33-second mark were not the numbers of a vehicle performing nominally. They were the numbers of a vehicle that was no longer a vehicle. Pressure readings collapsing, temperature spikes propagating through the engine compartment, the guidance system outputting data that had the specific flat quality of instruments that have lost the thing they were measuring. The camera feeds confirmed what the telemetry implied. The Falcon 1 had become a fireball over the Pacific. It fell back toward Omelik Island, and some of the debris reached the ground, and among the pieces of hardware that survived the fall, aluminum structural components, electronics, the scattered evidence of what had been, 33 seconds earlier, a functional rocket, was a small satellite payload. It was the Falconsat-2, a student-built research satellite from the United States Air Force Academy. It had survived the crash. It was sitting in the wreckage, undamaged, waiting to be retrieved, a small irony in the middle of a large disaster. Musk stared at the screens. The room around him had the quality of a place in which something irreversible has just occurred, the specific stillness that follows a sudden and significant loss, before the human responses to loss have had time to organize themselves into something coherent. Engineers who had been watching the telemetry were now looking at each other, or at the floor, or at the tracking screens that showed nothing where the vehicle had been. Some were doing the thing that engineers do when the work fails, reaching immediately for the data, for the analysis, for the discipline of investigation, as a way of not yet being fully present to what the failure meant. Musk let the silence last for exactly as long as it needed to last, which was not very long. He turned to the team and said, with the specific, direct simplicity that those present have quoted in various accounts of this moment, that they were going to find out what happened, fix it, and fly again. He said it without the performance of confidence, not the forced cheerfulness of a leader trying to manage morale by denying reality, but the flat, declarative statement of someone who had already passed through the moment of devastation and arrived at the only response he considered useful. The grief, if it was there, and it was there, witnesses are consistent on this, visible in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his silence before he spoke, was not a public event. The decision was. The world outside Kwajalein, into which this failure was released, was, in March of 2006, a world that had been watching SpaceX with a particular mixture of curiosity and skepticism, that attaches to enterprises that are either visionary or delusional and have not yet resolved the ambiguity. The space community had been following the company's development with genuine interest. The technical papers, the engine test results, the progression from concept to hardware had been documented and discussed among aerospace engineers who were capable of evaluating what they were seeing, and who had arrived at assessments ranging from genuinely impressed to cautiously optimistic to specifically concerned about the areas where SpaceX's approach departed from established practice. The established aerospace press had covered the company with the slightly patronizing interest that legacy institutions extend to insurgents who have not yet demonstrated that their insurgency is real. Articles about SpaceX in 2005 and early 2006 tended to carry the implicit framing of the story that hadn't happened yet. The ambitious startup, the charismatic founder, the bold claims, the pending test of whether any of it was real. The question had now received an answer, and the answer was a fireball and a debris field. And the coverage that followed the Flight 1 failure was not unkind, but it was not encouraging. And it had the quality of people updating their prior probability estimates in the direction they had perhaps always expected to update them. The financial context amplified every element of the pressure Musk was experiencing. He had committed $100 million to SpaceX and had burned through the majority of it before the first rocket left the pad. The remaining capital was enough to fund additional launch attempts. 2, perhaps 3, depending on the costs of the pad repair and the vehicle rebuild and the ongoing operations that an active launch program required. But it was not enough to absorb unlimited failure. Each launch attempt had a cost that was not merely financial but temporal, measured in the months required to rebuild and retest and redeploy to Kwajalein. And each month was a month during which Tesla was also consuming capital, also approaching its own series of crises, also making demands on a personal fortune that had seemed large in 2002 and was beginning in 2006 to feel finite in a way it had not felt before. The post-mortem analysis of Flight 1's failure was conducted with the thoroughness that SpaceX had built into its culture as the primary institutional response to things going wrong, not as a bureaucratic compliance exercise, but as a genuine engineering investigation, conducted by the people who had built the system, and who therefore understood its failure modes with the intimate knowledge that comes from having made the decisions that produce them. The root cause was identified within weeks. An aluminum B-nut fitting in the fuel line, positioned near the base of the engine, had corroded during the 6 months the vehicle had spent on the launch pad at Amlak. The corrosion had developed because the fitting was aluminum in an environment, the tropical Pacific with its salt air and humidity and the specific chemical environment of liquid oxygen propellant systems, that was hostile to aluminum in ways that the material specifications written in El Segundo had not adequately accounted for. The fitting had failed at 33 seconds, releasing fuel that ignited on contact with the hot engine components, and the vehicle had been lost. It was, as failure causes go, almost insultingly mundane. Not a fundamental design flaw. Not a failure of the propulsion system that Mueller and his team had spent years developing. Not a guidance error or a structural failure or any of the technically complex failure modes that the engineering reviews had spent the most time analyzing. It was a nut. A corroded nut, in a location that had been accessible and inspectable and whose condition, had someone with the right knowledge been looking for the right thing, might have been identified and addressed before the countdown began. The lesson was not that SpaceX had failed to be careful. The lesson was about the specific, unforgiving character of the aerospace environment, the way it finds the gap you did not know existed, the tolerance you did not know was too loose, the assumption you did not know you had made. The rocket equation does not care about effort or intention or the number of hours logged in the engineering review. It cares about whether the nut is the right material in the right environment. And if it is not, it will tell you, and the telling will happen at the worst possible moment with the maximum possible consequence. Musk absorbed this lesson with the specific quality of absorption that distinguishes between understanding a principle intellectually and having it written into your operational DNA by the experience of a 33-second flight that ended in fire. He had known in the abstract that aerospace was unforgiving. He had built a culture that took precision seriously and that treated the gap between specification and reality as an engineering emergency rather than an acceptable variance. And it had not been enough, because the gap had been in a place he had not looked, in a specification that had seemed adequate, until the Pacific demonstrated that it was not. The figure who stands at the center of this chapter's relational architecture is Tom Mueller, and the failure of Flight 1 tested the relationship between him and Musk in ways that the preceding 4 years of development had not. Mueller had built the Merlin engine. The Merlin had worked. The failure was not in the propulsion system that he had designed and tested and argued for across hundreds of engineering reviews and thousands of test stand hours. It was in a component at the interface between his system and the vehicle structure, a boundary condition in engineering terms, where responsibility was shared, and therefore where the assumption of coverage could develop a gap. Mueller knew this. Musk knew this. The postmortem made it explicit, and the explicitness was important because it meant the failure could be owned precisely rather than generally. What the interaction between them in the aftermath of the failure revealed was something about the specific quality of Musk's response to people who had done their work correctly when the system failed anyway. He did not reassign blame. He did not extract retribution from the person whose system had functioned as designed. He directed the engineering response toward the actual cause with the precision that the postmortem had produced. And he treated Mueller's team's contribution to the investigation with the specific respect of someone who understood that the analysis was only possible because the people who had built the system knew it well enough to identify what had gone wrong with the part of it they hadn't built. Mueller, for his part, threw himself into the redesign with the intensity of someone who had watched something he built perform correctly, and had watched it not be enough, and who understood that not enough was the only verdict that mattered in a program where the customer was orbital mechanics and the grading was pass-fail. The pad at Omlik was rebuilt. The fuel line was redesigned with stainless steel fittings in the locations where the salt environment would be present during extended pad time. The vehicle was rebuilt with the modifications the failure had required, and the modifications required by the failure analysis, and the modifications required by the modifications, in the recursive engineering loop that follows every serious failure and that consumes time and money at a rate that is always higher than the initial estimate and always lower than the cost of not doing it thoroughly. The second launch attempt was scheduled for 2007. The team returned to Kwajalein carrying the redesigned vehicle and the knowledge of what the first failure had cost, not just the hardware and the payload and the financial reserves that the rebuild had consumed, but something less tangible and harder to replace, which was the specific confidence that comes from a first flight that succeeds, a confidence that SpaceX had been unable to acquire and that the second attempt would now have to provide under the added pressure of demonstrating that the first failure had been learned from rather than merely survived. What no one on the team could have fully reckoned with, in the heat and the logistics and the engineering intensity of preparing the second vehicle, was that the first failure had been the easy part, that the sequence of events that awaited them before SpaceX finally, on its fourth attempt, achieved orbit, would test not just the engineering but the financial and psychological reserves of a company and a founder in ways that the 33 seconds of Flight 1 had only begun to suggest, and that the storm coming toward them was not single failure but an accumulation of them, each one arriving before the previous one had finished costing everything it was going to cost. Chapter 34. Flight 2, the Near Miss in Orbit 2007. The telemetry showed the first stage performing perfectly, and for 3 minutes the world was exactly what Musk had calculated it should be. The Merlin engine was producing thrust within the predicted envelope. The vehicle was tracking the planned trajectory with the fidelity that the guidance team had spent months refining. The acoustic signature coming through the audio feeds from the tracking cameras had the quality, the specific, sustained authoritative roar of a correctly operating liquid propellant engine that engineers learn to read the way musicians read a chord, hearing not just the sound but its internal structure, the information it contains about the system producing it. In the launch control station on Kwajalein, the people who had rebuilt this vehicle from the debris of the first attempt, who had spent the 14 months since that fireball redesigning the fuel system and requalifying the components and shipping everything back across the Pacific to an island that was only accessible by boat, were watching numbers that were telling them that the work had been done correctly. Then the first stage separated, and the second stage ignited, and the Kestrel engine began its burn. And for several more minutes the trajectory continued to build, altitude increasing, velocity increasing, the vehicle climbing through the upper atmosphere toward the specific combination of speed and height that constitutes orbit, and the numbers remained good. The Falcon 1 reached space. It crossed the Kármán line, the 100-kilometer altitude that the international community had designated as the boundary between atmosphere and space, and kept climbing, and the engineers in the control station experienced a sensation that is difficult to describe to people who have not spent years building toward a specific physical achievement and then watched it happen. Not quite celebration, not quite relief, but something that contains both and is larger than either. The specific emotional frequency of a thing becoming real that has been real only in equations and simulations for a very long time. Musk watched the numbers, and his expression, by the accounts of people near him, had opened in a way that his face did not often open. The specific vulnerability of someone allowing themselves to feel something before they have confirmed that feeling it is safe. It was not yet safe. At the 3-minute and 19-second mark of the second stage burn, the telemetry from the Kestrel engine changed. The thrust numbers began to decay. Not catastrophically, not the sudden collapse that had characterized the first flight's failure, but with the gradual, unmistakable signature of an engine that was losing the propellant flow it needed to maintain combustion. The velocity curve, which had been climbing toward the 7.9 kilometers per second that low Earth orbit required, flattened. Then it began to fall. The vehicle was in space, above the atmosphere, in the vacuum, but it was not in orbit, and the difference between those two conditions is not a matter of altitude but of speed, and the speed was no longer increasing. The Kestrel shut down 1 minute and 11 seconds before the end of its planned burn. The Falcon 1 arced downward toward the Pacific. The cause, when the post-mortem analysis assembled the data into a coherent failure narrative, was a phenomenon called propellant slosh. The sloshing of liquid propellant inside the second stage tank during the coast phase between first and second stage burns, a period during which the vehicle was in a low-gravity environment and the liquid was free to move in ways that ground tests and simulations had not fully captured. The slosh had uncovered the propellant feed inlet at the bottom of the tank momentarily, allowing a bubble of pressurant gas to enter the feed line. The gas bubble had reached the engine at a critical moment in the burn, disrupting the propellant flow, and the engine's self-preservation systems had done what they were designed to do, shut down to prevent damage from an off-nominal propellant mixture. The engine had worked correctly. The guidance system had worked correctly. The first stage had worked correctly. The vehicle had reached space for the first time in SpaceX's history. And it had not reached orbit because of the behavior of a liquid in a tank during a phase of flight that lasted less than 5 minutes, and that the simulation models had treated as benign. The year 2007 was the year in which the gap between what Musk had promised and what SpaceX had delivered was becoming a specific liability in ways that the first flight's failure had not yet fully activated. The first failure had been absorbed by the community of SpaceX's supporters and customers with the understanding that first flights fail. The history of every significant launch vehicle included first flight failures, and the appropriate response to a first flight failure was to identify the cause and fix it, not to conclude that the program was fundamentally flawed. This framing had held, and SpaceX had benefited from it. The second failure was harder to absorb under the same framing, because the second flight was not a first flight. It was a second flight, and second flights that fail, even when they fail closer to the goal than the first flight, even when they fail for a different and more tractable reason, activate a different kind of concern. They activate the concern that the program has a systematic problem, that the failures are not isolated incidents in a convergent learning curve, but data points in a pattern that may not converge. They activate, in the people who are paying for payloads, and in the people who are funding the enterprise, and in the founder who has staked his reputation and his fortune on the outcome, the question that every iterative failure program eventually has to answer: is this getting better, or is it just getting different? Musk was operating in 2007 under financial pressures that had been building since the first flight's failure, and that the 14 months of rebuild and relaunch had intensified in ways that the original budget had not anticipated. The $100 million committed to SpaceX at founding had been substantially consumed. The company had signed launch contracts with commercial customers and with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the revenue from those contracts was real but contingent on eventual success, which the second failure had again deferred. Tesla was consuming capital at a rate that the original projections had underestimated, as the company struggled with the engineering challenges of the Roadster development program and the manufacturing realities of building an electric sports car from a converted Lotus Elise platform. The personal financial picture was one that Musk discussed rarely and acknowledged only obliquely in public, but that the people closest to him understood with the clarity of those who have watched someone's financial cushion compress. He was not yet in crisis, but the direction of travel was visible, and the speed of travel was increasing, and the distance to the edge was shorter than it had been. The specific cruelty of Flight 2's failure, the thing that distinguished it psychologically from the first failure and that made it, in some ways, harder to process, was the altitude at which it occurred. Flight 1 had failed at 33 seconds, close to the ground, early enough that the vehicle's trajectory had barely begun. It was a full and total failure, but it was also a clean one. The gap between what happened and what was supposed to happen was enormous, and therefore, in a perverse way, less tormenting than the near miss. Flight 2 reached space. It crossed the line. The guidance numbers were good, the staging worked, the second engine ignited, and then, 5 minutes from orbit, the propellant sloshed. 5 minutes. The vehicle had been 5 minutes from becoming the first privately developed orbital rocket in history, a distinction that would have changed the company's funding trajectory, its customer pipeline, its standing with NASA, its valuation, and the entire narrative of what private spaceflight could achieve. And it had fallen short by 5 minutes because of the behavior of a liquid in a tank. Musk did not share the full weight of this publicly. What he shared, in the communication he sent to SpaceX employees and customers after the failure, was the post-mortem analysis, the identified cause, the proposed fix, and the timeline for the third attempt. The communication was direct, technically specific, and notably free of the euphemism and damage control language that corporate communications about failures typically deploy. He described what happened, why it happened, and what was going to be done about it. He did not apologize for the failure exactly, but he acknowledged it without qualification, and the acknowledgement had the quality of a man who respected his audience too much to offer them a polished version of a bad outcome. The fix for the slosh problem was, relative to the emotional weight of the failure, almost elegantly simple. The Kestrel engine would be restarted after a brief coast phase, rather than burning continuously from second-stage ignition. The restart would allow any gas introduced during the coast phase to be purged before the main burn began. The solution required changes to the flight software and the propellant management system, but it did not require a fundamental redesign of the vehicle or the engine. It was, in the vocabulary of iterative engineering, a patch, a targeted correction to a specific failure mode that left the rest of the design intact. This was what the first principles method looked like in practice when applied to failure rather than to cost. Find the precise location of the gap, understand it completely, fix it minimally. Do not redesign the whole system, because one part of it failed. Redesign the part that failed. Resist the pressure to over-respond, which is the particular failure mode of organizations that are frightened by their own failures, and reach for comprehensive solutions to targeted problems, producing complexity in the process that creates new failure modes while addressing the original one. The figure who shaped the texture of SpaceX's response to Flight 2, in ways that have not always received adequate attention, is Gwynne Shotwell, whose role as the company's chief commercial officer meant that she was managing the relationships with customers who had just watched their launch provider fail to reach orbit for the second consecutive time. The customer conversations she was having, in the weeks after Flight 2, were, by any reasonable assessment, among the more difficult professional conversations available to a person working in the commercial launch industry. She was calling people who had contracted to put their payloads on SpaceX rockets, Defense Department clients, commercial satellite operators, academic institutions, and explaining that the vehicle had reached space but had not reached orbit, and that the cause had been identified, and that the fix was in progress, and that the timeline for the next attempt was being established. She was asking them, implicitly, to continue to trust a company that was 2 for 2 in failure. What she had to work with, the thing that made these conversations possible rather than merely necessary, was the quality of the post-mortem analysis SpaceX had produced. The analysis was technically rigorous enough that customers who had their own aerospace engineers could read it and reach their own conclusions about whether the cause had been correctly identified and whether the proposed fix was adequate. This was not an accident. Musk had insisted on the specificity and the technical depth of the failure analysis, partly because specificity was how engineers thought, and partly because he understood, with the instinct of someone who had been building companies long enough to understand that trust is built in the details, that a vague explanation of failure was indistinguishable from a concealed one. The customers waited. Not all of them, and not without conditions, but enough of them, and with enough provisional confidence that the third launch attempt remained viable. Shotwell held the relationships together with the specific, quiet competence of someone who is very good at the thing she is doing, and who does not require the credit for it, who understands that the company's survival in this period depends on her ability to maintain the commercial relationships through the engineering failures, and who performs that maintenance without drama or complaint and with a consistency that the chaos of the development program made more rather than less essential. The third launch was being prepared with the weight of 2 failures behind it, and a financial runway that Musk had privately acknowledged in conversations with members of his inner circle was no longer unlimited. The budget had numbers in it that were specific and finite, and that the burn rate was approaching with a steadiness that the schedule could not negotiate with. The third flight needed to reach orbit, not merely because orbit was the goal, but because orbit was the condition under which SpaceX could raise the additional capital, execute the NASA contracts that were beginning to come into view, and justify the continued existence of a company that had been, for 4 years, consuming resources without producing the outcome those resources had been committed to produce. What Musk did not yet know, in the summer of 2007, was that the third launch would fail too, that it would fail for a reason more ironic and more operationally painful than either of the first 2 failures, and that the failure would arrive at the precise moment when his personal finances, his marriage, and his 2 companies had all converged on a single point of maximum vulnerability, a confluence so precisely timed and so comprehensively threatening that the people who knew him best would later describe it as the period in which they were not certain, for the first time, that he was going to survive it. Chapter 35. Flight 3. The Stage Separation Collision, 2008. The separation looked clean on the cameras, and for 4 seconds everyone in the control station believed it was over. Not failed, over. Finished. Successful. The kind of over that resolves years of work into a single, clarifying confirmation that the thing being attempted is the thing that can be done. The first stage had burned correctly. The staging event, the moment of pyrotechnic separation at which the spent first stage detaches from the second stage and falls away, allowing the second stage engine to ignite and continue the ascent, had produced the visual signature that separation is supposed to produce, a clean break, the 2 vehicle sections moving apart in the vacuum above the atmosphere, the second stage continuing upward on its planned trajectory while the first stage began its descent back toward the Pacific. 4 seconds. Then the cameras showed something that was not in the flight plan, not in any flight plan, not in the failure mode analysis, not in the engineering reviews that had been conducted in the months of preparation for this launch. The first stage, rather than falling cleanly away from the second stage, was moving back toward it. The residual thrust in the new Merlin 1C engine, thrust that the engine was still producing in its final moments of operation, because the engine upgrade that SpaceX had incorporated into Flight 3 had altered the thrust decay curve in ways that the separation timing had not been updated to account for, was pushing the spent first stage upward, closing the distance between it and the second stage, and then the 2 stages made contact and the contact was not gentle and the telemetry from the second stage ceased. The vehicle that had just, for the 3rd time in 3 attempts, failed to reach orbit was the most capable version of the Falcon 1 that SpaceX had yet flown. The Merlin 1C engine was a genuine upgrade from its predecessors, more efficient, producing more thrust, representing the accumulated learning of 6 years of propulsion development compressed into a hardware revision that Mueller's team had every reason to be proud of. It was, by every test stand metric, a better engine. The separation timing that had been adequate for the previous engine was not adequate for this one, because a better engine with more residual thrust requires a longer coast period between first stage cutoff and separation, and the coast period had not been adjusted, and no one had caught it, and the third flight ended in a collision between two pieces of hardware that had been designed never to touch each other after staging. Musk was standing in the launch control station when the telemetry flatlined. The people around him have described the room in the seconds after the loss with a consistency that speaks to the specific, collective character of the experience. A silence that was different from the silence after the first failure, and different again from the silence after the second, because this silence had a quality of culmination to it. The specific weight of a third consecutive failure landing on people who had spent the intervening years not merely repairing hardware but sustaining, through an act of collective will, that the circumstances made more demanding with each passing month, the belief that the next attempt would be different. The next attempt had not been different. The next attempt had produced a new failure mode, which was, in some technical sense, progress. SpaceX was no longer failing for the same reasons, was demonstrating the ability to identify and eliminate specific failure causes, was building a real and hard-won understanding of the vehicle's behavior across the flight envelope. But progress, in August of 2008, was a word that required a very particular frame of reference to be useful, and the frame of reference available to the people in the Kwajalein control station did not naturally produce it. The world outside Omelik Island, in August of 2008, was a world that was itself approaching a catastrophe it had not yet fully recognized. The financial crisis that would detonate in September, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the near failure of the global banking system, the evaporation of credit markets that had been treating risk as though it were not real, was already visible in the stress signals of the housing market and the derivative structures built on top of it, but it had not yet arrived in its full system-level form. The economy was weakening. Capital was tightening. The appetite for risk among investors, which had been the oxygen supply of the startup ecosystem throughout the decade, was beginning to constrict in the specific preliminary way that precedes a full contraction. For Musk, who was attempting to raise capital for two companies simultaneously, Tesla, which needed funding to bridge the gap between the Roadster's development challenges and the production launch that would demonstrate the company's viability, and SpaceX, which needed a successful launch to unlock the NASA contracts and commercial revenue that would allow it to survive beyond its founder's personal resources, the timing was a compound problem. The financial crisis was arriving at precisely the moment when both companies were at their most vulnerable, requiring capital most urgently, and offering potential investors the least evidence of near-term success. The personal financial situation was now acute in a way that Musk had been managing privately and acknowledging rarely. The $100 million committed to SpaceX at founding was effectively consumed. The $70 million invested in Tesla had been substantially drawn upon, and Tesla needed more. The reserve that had seemed, in 2002, like a sufficient cushion against the expected costs of two ambitious ventures, had proven insufficient against the actual costs, which exceeded the expected costs in the way that actual costs always exceed expected costs, and in the specific, compounded way that occurs when two companies are simultaneously encountering their deepest challenges. He had been borrowing money. This was not widely known outside his inner circle, but it was real. Personal loans from friends, obligations that carried the specific weight of debts owed not to institutions, but to people who had trusted him with their own resources at a moment when the institutional market had correctly assessed the risk as high. The man who had walked away from PayPal with $180 million was, in the late summer of 2008, having conversations about whether he could make rent, and the conversations were not hypothetical. The question was not whether the third failure would hurt SpaceX. The question was whether SpaceX would survive it. The post-mortem was conducted in the weeks following the loss, and it had the specific quality of a failure analysis conducted by people who were simultaneously doing the engineering work and monitoring the organizational atmosphere for signs of the thing that the engineering work could not fix, the moment at which enough people decide that the situation is not recoverable, and begin the individual calculations that precede departure. Every organization that has experienced sustained failure has this atmosphere, a background frequency of uncertainty that attaches itself to the daily work, and that leadership either addresses or allows to amplify. And SpaceX in August of 2008 had accumulated enough consecutive failure to make the atmosphere real. The cause analysis was, as the first principles method required, specific and technical. The Merlin 1C's thrust decay curve was longer than the Merlin 1A's. The coast period between cutoff and separation had not been extended to account for the difference. The residual thrust had closed the distance between the stages. The contact had damaged the second stage. The fix was straightforward to specify and would not require a fundamental redesign of the vehicle. Extend the coast period, confirm the revised timing against the new engine's thrust decay data, update the flight software. Technically, it was a tractable problem. Financially, fixing it required money that Musk did not clearly have. There is a moment from the days immediately following the Flight 3 failure that has been described by members of the SpaceX leadership team, and that functions as the clearest keyhole into Musk's character at the point of maximum pressure that his career had yet produced. He gathered the company, not the senior leadership team, not the engineering leads, but everyone, the full SpaceX workforce, and he spoke to them without notes, without a prepared statement, without the mediation of a communications team or a carefully crafted message. He told them what had happened. He told them why it had happened. He told them that SpaceX had enough resources for one more launch attempt, and that the fourth attempt would reach orbit, and that the company was not going to give up. He delivered this not as a performance of confidence, but as a statement of intention. The specific, flat declaration of a man who has considered the alternative and rejected it, not because the alternative is impossible, but because he has decided it is unacceptable, and the decision is final, and he is not particularly interested in discussing it further. Several engineers who were present have described the response in similar terms. The room, which had arrived carrying the weight of 3 failures, and the ambient uncertainty of an organization that was not sure it was going to exist in 12 months, left with something different. Not euphoria. Not the uncomplicated belief that everything was going to work out. Something more durable than both of those. The specific functional conviction of people who have been told, by someone who has given them no reason to doubt his directness, that the situation is going to be addressed, and who have decided, provisionally, to believe it. The relationship at the center of this chapter, the one that most clearly illuminates both the stakes and the texture of what SpaceX was enduring, is the one between Musk and the company's workforce as a collective entity, but it is given its most specific form through the lens of Chris Thompson, the company's vice president of structures, and one of the senior engineers who had been at SpaceX long enough to have built the institutional memory that the company's continuity depended on. Thompson represented the class of early SpaceX employee who had made a genuine sacrifice to be there, had left a career at an established aerospace contractor, had accepted below-market salary for equity in a company that had not yet demonstrated it could reach orbit, had brought not just technical skill, but the specific hard-to-replace knowledge of what the company had done and why, and what had been learned from it that could not be easily rebuilt if it walked out the door. The retention of people like Thompson, after 3 consecutive failures, was not guaranteed by contract or by compensation. It was sustained by belief, belief in the mission, belief in the leadership, belief that the fourth attempt would be different, and belief is a resource that requires maintenance. Musk maintained it the only way he knew how, by being present, by being direct, by demonstrating through the quality of his engagement with the failure analysis that he was not managing the optics of the situation but actually solving the problem, and by making clear through both word and action that departure was not a concept he was entertaining. His refusal to consider the company's failure was not, Thompson and others have noted, the bluster of someone in denial. It was the specific, grounded refusal of someone who had done the calculation and concluded that the fourth attempt was viable, and who was behaving according to that conclusion rather than according to the emotional weight of 3 consecutive losses. Thompson stayed. Most of the senior engineers stayed. The institutional knowledge that SpaceX had accumulated across 6 years of hardware development and 3 launch campaigns, knowledge that lived not in documents, but in the minds of the people who had built the vehicle and stood the watches and conducted the postmortems, remained intact. The fourth rocket was already in partial assembly. The components had been ordered. The production work had begun. The manufacturing timeline had been established before the third failure occurred, a planning decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire program. Musk had authorized the fourth vehicle's production to begin before the third launch, in the specific anticipation that the program would need another attempt regardless of the third flight's outcome, an anticipation that at the time had the quality of operational prudence and that in the aftermath of the third failure had the quality of prescience. The fourth rocket existed. The cause of the third failure was understood. The fix was technically straightforward. The money to execute it was a problem, but a problem with a solution that was not yet foreclosed, though the window in which that solution remained available was narrowing with the specific, calendar-driven urgency of a company that was not going to be able to sustain operations indefinitely on the strength of the founder's determination alone. What Musk could not know, in the days after Flight 3, was that the financial crisis that was about to consume the global economy would arrive at precisely the moment he was attempting to raise the capital that SpaceX and Tesla both required to survive it, that the world was about to make a very difficult situation geometrically worse, and that the decisions he would be forced to make in the weeks between August and December of 2008 would represent the most concentrated test of everything he was, and that the outcome of those decisions would determine not whether he lost some of what he had built, but whether he lost all of it. Chapter 36. The 2008 Nightmare Year, a Triple Collapse. The email arrived at 2 a.m, and Musk read it 3 times before he put the phone down. It was from Tesla's finance team, and it contained the number that he had been watching approach for months with the specific, nauseating clarity of someone who can see a wall coming and cannot find the break. The cash position. The burn rate. The number of weeks remaining before the company could no longer make payroll. The number was not abstract. It had the concrete physical weight of a thing that has stopped being a projection and become a fact, the kind of fact that does not improve with rereading or with the particular form of hope that consists of believing the arithmetic might be wrong if you examine it from a different angle. The arithmetic was not wrong. He set the phone on the nightstand in the Bel Air house that was itself now a source of financial pressure. The mortgage, the staff, the cost of maintaining a household whose scale had been appropriate to a different version of his financial situation than the one that currently existed. And he lay in the dark with the specific wakeful quality of a person whose mind will not perform the merciful function of suspending itself for sleep because it has too many active processes running simultaneously, and none of them are close to resolution. 3 failures at SpaceX. Tesla approaching insolvency. A marriage that had been deteriorating for years and that had, in the course of 2008, reached the point of formal dissolution. Justine had filed for divorce in September, ending 8 years of a partnership that had been, from its earliest days, organized around the gravitational dominance of his ambitions, and that had finally, under the accumulated weight of grief and absence and the specific loneliness of being the person orbiting a force rather than the force itself, come apart in the manner of things that have been under sustained pressure for too long. And outside the walls of the house, the global financial system was in the process of its most spectacular failure in 80 years, consuming the capital markets that Musk needed to rescue his companies with a thoroughness that no individual circumstance could have engineered. He was 37 years old. He had 5 children under the age of 6. He was borrowing money from friends to cover personal expenses. And he had a 4th rocket being assembled in a warehouse in California, and a car company that had not yet delivered its first production vehicle, and a personal philosophy that held, as its non-negotiable premise, that giving up was not a category of action he recognized. The year 2008 was, in its macroeconomic character, a year that will occupy historians for decades, a moment of systemic failure so complete that it required the intervention of governments and central banks at a scale not seen since the Depression to prevent it from becoming something worse. The collapse of Bear Stearns in March had been the first visible fracture. The government-sponsored conservatorship of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in September had been a larger one. But the event that crystallized the crisis into its full system-level form was the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008, a Monday morning announcement that sent a wave of panic through the global financial system, freezing credit markets, destroying equity values, and producing in the minds of investors a risk aversion so total that the willingness to deploy capital into anything, let alone into 2 startup companies building rockets and electric cars, approached zero. Musk had been trying to raise funding for Tesla since the spring. The company had been burning through its Series C capital at a rate that the original projections had underestimated, as the complexity of bringing the Roadster to production had revealed itself to be significantly greater than the plan had anticipated. The battery system required more engineering work. The transmission had required a complete redesign. The relationship with Lotus, who was supplying the Elise platform on which the Roadster was based, had introduced dependencies that the manufacturing timeline had not fully accounted for. Each delay and each engineering revision had consumed capital, and the capital had finite limits, and by the summer of 2008 the limits were in sight. The timing was, in the specific way that the universe occasionally achieves a kind of precision in its cruelties, nearly perfect. Tesla needed capital in the second half of 2008. The second half of 2008 was the period in which capital became unavailable at any price to any company that could not demonstrate immediate and certain positive cash flows, which Tesla, a startup that had not yet delivered a single production vehicle, manifestly could not. The investors who might, in a normal market environment, have looked at Tesla's technology and its team and its potential and written a check were not writing checks. They were watching their existing portfolios contract and managing their own survival and doing the arithmetic on what a prolonged credit crisis would mean for their fund's ability to raise their next vehicles. The core conflict of this chapter, the one that organized everything else, was a decision that Musk faced in the late autumn of 2008 that was unlike any decision the first principles method could resolve, because it was not a technical decision or a market decision or even a financial decision in the ordinary sense. It was a decision about identity. The decision was this: he had enough money remaining if he liquidated carefully to save one company. Not both. 1. The money that would be required to keep Tesla alive through the financing round that kept failing to close, combined with the money required to fund the fourth SpaceX launch attempt, exceeded what he could provide from his remaining resources. The rational allocation, the one that a financial advisor, a board member, or virtually any external observer would have recommended, was to choose the company with the better near-term survival prospects and concentrate the remaining capital there, accepting the loss of the other as the price of preserving something. He did not make this decision. He made the other one. He split the remaining capital between both companies, in the full knowledge that this allocation gave each company less runway than either needed to be certain of survival. And he went looking for the additional funding that would bridge the gap, in a credit market that was actively hostile to such a search, with the specific relentless urgency of someone who has decided that the only acceptable outcome is a world in which both companies survive and who is therefore not entertaining the conversations that begin from a different premise. The anecdote that captures this period with the most concentrated clarity comes from a conversation Musk had with a reporter from CNBC in the fall of 2008, in which he was asked directly whether he was concerned that SpaceX and Tesla might both fail. He said that he thought it was likely that both would fail, and that the expectation of failure was not the same as the acceptance of it, and that he intended to work as hard as it was physically possible to work to prevent that outcome regardless of the probability assessment. He said this without the performance of bravado, without the forced cheerfulness of a man managing his public image, and with the specific, flat delivery of someone who has already grieved the possibility of failure and arrived on the other side of the grieving, at the only position that remained: you do the work anyway. The interview, when it aired, produced responses ranging from admiration to concern. Concern of the specific kind that attaches to people who appear to have passed through the membrane that separates rational risk assessment from something more fundamental and less negotiable. The divorce from Justine was proceeding through its legal machinery with the specific, grinding unhappiness of a dissolution that both parties had seen coming for long enough that the formal filing was less a shock than a confirmation. Justine had given a public account of the marriage and its end in a personal essay that was characteristically honest and characteristically painful, describing a relationship in which she had felt, despite being loved, subordinated, her own identity slowly organized around the needs and the schedule and the psychological demands of a man whose primary relationship was with the work, and who had not always been capable of distinguishing between the wife who loved him and the resource that the mission required. Musk did not publicly contest the characterization. He absorbed it with the characteristic compression that he brought to personal pain, not publicly, not in a way that generated a counter-narrative, but inward, in whatever internal space he maintained for the things that cost him something he was not going to show. The 5 children were now the shared responsibility of 2 people whose marriage had ended badly, in the middle of the most professionally catastrophic year of either of their lives, in a city where the cost of maintaining two separate households at anything approximating their previous standard was a pressure that the financial crisis had rendered actively untenable. The practical arrangements were made with the lawyers and the settlements, and the specific bureaucratic formality of the California family court system, but underneath the bureaucratic surface was the reality that 5 boys under 6, including twins and triplets born through IVF in the years after Nevada's death, required a stability that neither parent was, in the autumn of 2008, particularly positioned to provide. The figure who stands at the center of this chapter's relational architecture, and whose role in Musk's survival of this period has been consistently understated in the popular accounts, is Kimball Musk. Kimball had been present at the beginning, in the Zip2 office, sleeping on the same floor, building the first company with the same combination of enthusiasm and complementary temperament that he brought to everything he did with his brother. He had gone on to build his own ventures, had moved to New York and then to Colorado, had developed a life that was his own, and that had taken him away from the Silicon Valley orbit in which Elon operated. But in 2008, when the compound emergency was at its most acute, Kimball was one of the people Musk called. Kimball lent him money. Not a symbolic amount, real money, the kind that covered the actual expenses that Musk's depleted accounts could not, that provided the personal financial floor beneath which things would have become categorically worse. The loan had the quality of all transactions between brothers. It was not merely financial but relational, a statement about whose side you were on, made at the precise moment when the question of sides was not abstract but immediate and consequential. Kimball was on his brother's side. The money was extended without the conditions that institutional lenders attach to desperation borrowers, and without the public visibility that would have complicated the narrative Musk was trying to manage, the narrative in which he was in difficulty but not in crisis, in which the companies were struggling but not dying, in which the founder was under pressure but not broken. The loan was private, and it was real, and it mattered. The 4th SpaceX launch was being prepared through all of this. The engineers in the Hawthorne facility, SpaceX had moved from El Segundo to a larger space in Hawthorne, another industrial neighborhood in the Los Angeles basin, were working on the 4th vehicle with the knowledge shared by all of them in various degrees of specificity that this was the last attempt the company could afford. The funding that would allow a 5th attempt did not exist. The 4th rocket was being built on capital that had been assembled from the remaining resources of a founder who was simultaneously managing a divorce, a parallel company that was also approaching its own financial precipice, and the personal financial obligations of a life that had been structured for a level of wealth that no longer existed. The global financial crisis was entering its most acute phase in October of 2008. Barack Obama was defeating John McCain in an election that felt, to many Americans, like a referendum not just on policy, but on the kind of country they wanted to inhabit after the twin disasters of the financial collapse and the preceding 8 years of political and military choices. The mood was one of collective reckoning, of a nation arriving at a moment that required honest accounting of what had been built and what had been lost, and what was actually true about the institutions that were supposed to be managing the most complex systems in human civilization. In this context, the story of a man who had bet his entire fortune on building rockets and electric cars, and was now borrowing money from his brother while simultaneously trying to close a venture capital round in the worst credit market in 80 years, had a quality that was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying, depending entirely on whether you believed the 4th rocket was going to work. The 4th rocket was being prepared with a speed that the previous 3 campaigns had not matched, because speed was the only resource that remained available in abundance, and the vehicle would be ready for transport to Kwajalein in a matter of weeks. And the launch window that the orbital mechanics and the range schedule permitted was not flexible. And everything that Musk had built and lost and borrowed and endured for the previous 6 years was converging on a single point in the Pacific sky in the late summer of 2008, and the point would either hold or it would not, and the answer would arrive with the democratic indifference of a physical system that did not know or care what was at stake for the man watching the telemetry screens. And the waiting was the worst part, and the waiting was almost over. Chapter 37. Flight 4. The Christmas Miracle, September 2008. The countdown reached T-10 seconds and Elon Musk stopped breathing. Not literally. The autonomic systems continued their work as they do, indifferent to the weight of the moment. But in the specific, involuntary way that the body responds to the approach of an event, whose outcome it has been anticipating for so long that anticipation has become its own form of exhaustion. He was standing in the launch control station on Kwajalein, surrounded by engineers who had been awake for most of the preceding 48 hours, and the room had the quality that rooms acquire when the people in them have collectively decided that everything they have done for years is about to be graded in the most final and unambiguous way available. There was no partial credit in orbital mechanics. The rocket either reached orbit or it did not, and the bill either got paid or it did not, and the company either survived the next month or it did not. T-5. The engineers who had been at SpaceX from the early years and who were present on Kwajalein for the fourth launch have described the atmosphere in the control station with a consistency that suggests they were all attending to the same thing. Not the screens exactly and not each other, but the specific quality of the moment itself, the way it had a different texture than the 3 previous launch attempts, as though the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this point had changed the density of the air. T-0. The Merlin 1C ignited. The world of September 28, 2008 was a world in active crisis, and the crisis was not SpaceX's alone, though SpaceX's share of it was considerable. 13 days earlier, Lehman Brothers had filed for bankruptcy in what would become the defining event of the global financial collapse, the moment at which the crisis stopped being a problem for banks and became a problem for everyone. A systemic failure so comprehensive that the language required to describe it kept reaching for historical comparisons and finding them all inadequate. The credit markets had frozen. Equity markets were in freefall. The Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve were engaged in the most aggressive emergency intervention in American financial history, and the outcome of that intervention was not yet clear, and the uncertainty of it was producing in the business community a paralysis that made the ordinary challenges of raising venture capital, already nearly impossible for Musk's companies in the months preceding the collapse, essentially inconceivable. Tesla was negotiating the closing of a financing round that had been in process for months, and that kept failing to close because the investors who had verbally committed were finding reasons, one by one, to withdraw commitments that they had made in a market environment that no longer existed. The round needed to close before the end of the year. Tesla needed it to survive. The closing was not yet certain. Musk had invested the last of his available personal capital into the round, money borrowed in part from Kimball, money that represented not a calculated bet, but an act of something closer to pure will, the decision to put the last resource into the last chance because the alternative was to watch the thing die, and he had decided, in whatever private space that decision is made, that he was not going to do that. SpaceX had capital for one launch. 1. The fourth vehicle had been assembled and transported and erected on the omelet pad with the knowledge shared by the leadership team, and sensed by much of the broader company, that the fourth attempt was the terminal condition, the event at the end of which the answer would be yes or no, orbit or not, survival or dissolution. There was no fifth vehicle being assembled. There was no budget for a fifth attempt. The company had been built on the premise that Musk could reach orbit within 3 years for $100 million, and it had taken 6 years and consumed all of it, and the fourth rocket was the accounting of that gap. The specific conflict of Flight 4 was not technical, though it had a technical dimension. The staging fix that had been implemented after the third failure, the extended coast period between first stage cutoff and separation, designed to allow the Merlin 1C's residual thrust to decay before the stages separated, had been analyzed and tested and incorporated into the flight software with the thoroughness that the failure analysis required. The avionics team, led by Koenigsmann, had verified the timing across the full range of engine performance parameters. The propellant slosh mitigation from Flight 2 was still in place. The fuel line corrosion issue from Flight 1 had been addressed 2 launches ago. The fourth vehicle was the most thoroughly corrected iteration of the Falcon 1 yet flown, carrying the lessons of 3 failures in its design with a density that no original specification document could have achieved. The conflict was existential. The specific, compound pressure of an attempt that could not fail because the resources required to survive failure did not exist. This is a different kind of pressure than the ordinary engineering challenge of building a reliable rocket, and it operates differently on the people responsible for the outcome. It does not necessarily make them perform better. It makes the stakes of their ordinary performance incomparably higher, which is not the same thing, and which introduces a psychological variable that engineering rigor cannot fully control. Musk had managed this variable with the specific technique that his entire career had developed and refined, by treating the existential pressure as a fact to be acknowledged and then set aside, by focusing his public engagement with the team entirely on the technical problem rather than the financial stakes, by behaving in the control station and in the engineering reviews as though the question being answered was an engineering question rather than a survival question, because an engineering question had a correct answer and a survival question had only outcomes. The first stage burn lasted 2 minutes and 29 seconds and performed within the predicted envelope throughout. The staging event, the moment that had destroyed the third vehicle, occurred at the planned time following the extended coast period, and the first stage fell cleanly away, and the second stage engine ignited and the vehicle continued its ascent. The second stage burn lasted 6 minutes and 8 seconds. The Kestrel engine produced thrust within the predicted envelope throughout. The propellant management system maintained flow without the slosh-induced disruption that had terminated Flight 2. The guidance system tracked the planned trajectory within the tolerances that orbit insertion required. The numbers on the screens in the Kwajalein control station were, for 9 minutes and 17 seconds of total flight time, the numbers of a vehicle doing what it had been designed to do. At 9 minutes and 17 seconds after liftoff, the Falcon 1 achieved orbit. The velocity was 7.9 kilometers per second. The altitude was approximately 500 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The orbit was stable. The telemetry was nominal. The vehicle was, for the first time in the 6 years and hundreds of millions of dollars and 3 previous failures that had preceded this moment, where it was supposed to be. The control station erupted. The word is insufficient, and it is the right word. What happened in that room at that moment was not a professional response to a technical achievement. It was the release of 6 years of sustained collective tension, the specific physical expression of a compression that had been building since the first engine test in Mississippi, and that had been increased by 3 launch failures, and a financial crisis, and the personal disasters of the preceding 12 months, and the specific accumulated weight of being people who had believed in something that kept not working and had kept believing anyway. Engineers who had maintained, across thousands of hours of work and 3 catastrophic failures, the specific professional composure that their discipline requires, who had conducted postmortems without visible despair and rebuilt vehicles without visible doubt, were weeping. Openly, without apology, in the way that people weep when the thing they have been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to be put down. Musk wept too. This has been confirmed by multiple witnesses and by Musk himself, who has acknowledged it in subsequent interviews with the unguarded simplicity of someone who does not consider the weeping to require explanation. He had spent 6 years building toward this moment. He had spent his fortune building toward this moment. He had endured, in the preceding 12 months, the kind of compounded personal and professional loss that redefines a person's relationship to what they are capable of surviving. And now the rocket was in orbit, and the moment was real, and the emotion was the appropriate response to it, and he did not perform stoicism because stoicism was not what the moment required. He addressed the team while still visibly moved, and the address has been quoted and requoted enough to have acquired the status of a founding text in the SpaceX mythology. He told them that they had done something that was, in his words, incredibly difficult, and that he was proud of them, and that what they had demonstrated, that a small company operating on a fraction of the budget of the aerospace giants, with a team that fit in a single large room, could build and fly an orbital rocket from scratch, was going to change the world. He said it with the specific conviction of someone who was not managing a message, but making a statement, and the distinction was audible. And the room responded to it with the specific quality of people who have been told the truth about what they have accomplished. The figure whose relationship with Musk most crystallizes the meaning of Flight 4 is Tom Mueller, and the moment between them that has been most consistently described by people who were present is not the celebration itself but what preceded it. In the final minutes of the countdown, as the launch control station was managing the terminal sequence with the focused intensity of a system that had been through this enough times to be efficient, and recent enough in its failures to be unrelaxed. Mueller was at his station monitoring the propulsion system data, watching the Merlin 1C's pre-launch parameters with the attention of someone who had designed the engine and tested the engine and watched the engine perform correctly in every test environment available, and who was now waiting for the test environment that had not been available in any previous configuration, the one where everything worked. During the burn, as the Merlin 1C performed within the predicted envelope for the full duration of the first stage, Mueller's face had the quality of a man receiving a confirmation that he had been waiting for long enough, that the waiting had become part of his identity. He had built that engine in the face of budget constraints that the aerospace establishment had assessed as incompatible with the performance he was claiming. He had tested it through failures that had reflected not on its design but on the systems around it. He had rebuilt and refined and requalified it after each launch campaign with the methodical patience of someone who had decided that the correct response to repeated failure was repeated correction. When the staging event occurred cleanly, and the second stage ignited and the vehicle continued its ascent, Mueller did not celebrate. He watched the telemetry. He was still watching the telemetry when the orbit was confirmed, and the room exploded around him, and he allowed himself then the specific expression of a man who has been proven right by the most demanding judge available. Not a review board or a technical committee, but the physics which had accepted his engine's performance as adequate. Musk found him in the celebration, and the two men embraced with the specific, uncomplicated force of people who have been through something together that has no civilian equivalent, and who have arrived against the odds that both of them had privately calculated at the other side of it. The Falcon 1's successful orbital insertion was announced by SpaceX within hours of the achievement, and the response from the aerospace and technology communities was immediate and significant. NASA Administrator Mike Griffin called to congratulate Musk personally, a call that carried the specific institutional weight of the agency that had been the benchmark against which all private spaceflight was measured, acknowledging that the benchmark had been reached by someone outside the agency's walls. The aerospace press, which had been covering SpaceX's failures with a mixture of genuine sympathy and implicit skepticism, recalibrated in the manner of institutions that are updating a prior, not reversing their previous assessments exactly, but acknowledging that the new data point required a new model. The financial implications were not immediate. The global credit crisis did not pause to acknowledge SpaceX's achievement, and Tesla's financing round was still not closed, and Musk's personal financial situation did not resolve overnight. But the achievement had produced something that money could not directly buy: credibility. The kind of credibility that is only produced by doing the thing rather than claiming the ability to do it. SpaceX had reached orbit. The first principles analysis that Musk had assembled on a plane ride home from Moscow 6 years earlier had been validated by the most unambiguous validator available. 3 months later, on December 23, 2008, 2 days before Christmas, with Tesla's financing round still not closed and the financial crisis still consuming the economy, and Musk's personal accounts still operating on reserves that were not going to last indefinitely, NASA announced the award of a commercial resupply services contract to SpaceX worth $1.6 billion, a contract that represented the agency's bet that the company could develop the Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft and deliver cargo to the International Space Station, and that transformed SpaceX from a company that had proven it could reach orbit into a company that had a funded reason to do so at scale. The contract arrived like oxygen, arriving in a room where the air had been running out, and Musk, who had been borrowing money from friends to cover personal expenses 2 months earlier, was now the CEO of a company with a government contract larger than his original investment. And the companies that were supposed to change the world had survived the year that was supposed to have ended them, and the survival was real, but the cost of it had not yet been fully tallied, and the man standing at the beginning of the next chapter was not the same man who had stood at the beginning of this one, and the differences were going to matter in ways that neither he nor anyone around him had yet had time to fully understand. Chapter 38. The NASA CRS Contract, Ensuring Company Survival. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in December, and Musk took it standing up. He had been in the Hawthorne facility when his assistant flagged the incoming number, a Washington area code, a NASA extension, the specific combination that had been the object of months of lobbying and proposal preparation, and the kind of sustained institutional courtship that Musk found temperamentally difficult and strategically non-negotiable. He had understood for long enough to have built the understanding into SpaceX's operating architecture that the company's long-term survival required government revenue, not because the commercial launch market was insufficient in principle, but because the commercial market in 2008 was insufficient in practice, because the global financial crisis had frozen the capital flows that commercial satellite operators needed to fund new constellation deployments, and because the company that had just proved it could reach orbit needed with some urgency a customer capable of paying for the capability it had demonstrated. NASA was that customer. The Commercial Resupply Services Program, the CRS contract, in the shorthand of people who had been tracking its development, was the mechanism through which the agency intended to procure cargo transportation to the International Space Station from commercial providers, freeing NASA's own resources for the exploration missions that the vision for space exploration had prioritized and that required hardware that did not yet exist. The program had been in development for years, shaped by a policy framework that had been slowly, contentiously, and not without institutional resistance, evolving toward the acknowledgement that private companies might be capable of doing things that government agencies had previously reserved for themselves. The voice on the phone confirmed what the SpaceX government relations team had been told to expect, but had not been told to count on. NASA had selected SpaceX as one of 2 recipients of CRS contracts. The total value of the SpaceX award was $1.6 billion, payable across a series of cargo delivery missions to the station, using a launch vehicle and spacecraft that SpaceX had not yet fully developed. Musk said thank you. Then he put the phone down and walked back into the engineering floor and told the team. The world in which this contract arrived was a world that had been conducting a controlled demolition of its own financial architecture for 3 months, and the demolition was not finished. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost approximately 40% of its value since its October 2007 peak. The unemployment rate was climbing toward levels not seen since the early 1980s recession. General Motors and Chrysler were approaching the federal government for bailout loans that would ultimately require government ownership of 2 of the 3 companies that had defined American industrial identity for a century. The credit markets remained frozen in the specific way that occurs when the institutions that allocate capital have lost confidence in their own ability to assess risk, when the trust that underlies every financial transaction has been damaged at the level of the system rather than the level of any individual participant. In this environment, a government contract worth $1.6 billion was not merely significant. It was, in the most literal available sense, the difference between a company that existed in 12 months and a company that did not. The contract provided not just revenue, but the specific institutional validation that investor conversations required, the signal that a customer whose technical requirements were among the most demanding in the world, and whose due diligence processes were among the most rigorous, had evaluated SpaceX's capability and concluded that it was real. This was not a small satellite customer taking a risk on a new launch provider for the discount. This was NASA, deciding that the organization Musk had built in a Hawthorne warehouse was capable of resupplying a crewed space station. The contrast between where SpaceX had been in August and where it stood in December was of a magnitude that defied the ordinary vocabulary of business recovery. In August, the company had been preparing its last launch attempt on its last available capital, with its founder borrowing money from friends and managing a divorce, and watching a parallel company approach its own extinction simultaneously. In December, it was a NASA partner with a contract that would fund the development of the Falcon 9, a rocket significantly larger and more capable than the Falcon 1, requiring 9 Merlin engines in its first stage, and the Dragon spacecraft, a pressurized capsule capable of delivering not just cargo but eventually crew to the station. The development program that the CRS contract funded was not, in any traditional sense, a comfortable one. The contract was a fixed-price agreement, not cost-plus, the contracting structure that had governed NASA procurement for most of its history, but fixed price, meaning that SpaceX agreed to deliver the capability at a specified price regardless of what the actual development costs turned out to be. This was, from NASA's perspective, a deliberate policy choice, an attempt to introduce the commercial discipline of fixed-price competition into a procurement system that had been producing cost overruns for decades. From SpaceX's perspective, it was also a deliberate choice. Fixed-price contracts preserved the company's incentive to develop efficiently, because every dollar saved in development was a dollar that accrued to SpaceX rather than being passed through to the customer. And Musk's first principles cost model was built on the assumption that the efficiency incentive was the mechanism that made the whole enterprise work. The core conflict of this chapter is not the securing of the contract. That had been achieved, against the backdrop of the most hostile capital environment in a generation, by the specific combination of Flight 4's success and the policy evolution at NASA that the CRS program represented. The core conflict was the gap between what the contract funded and what the contract required. The Falcon 9, which had been designed and partially developed but had not yet been built to flight readiness, and the Dragon spacecraft, which was an entirely new vehicle class that SpaceX had not yet constructed in any form. The $1.6 billion was not a guarantee of success. It was a funded obligation to attempt something more difficult than anything SpaceX had yet attempted, on a timeline that the agency's manifest and the station's resupply needs would constrain, with a fixed price structure that would not absorb the cost of failure the way cost-plus contracts absorbed it. If SpaceX could not develop the Falcon 9 and Dragon on schedule, and within the contracted price, the consequences would not be merely financial. They would be the termination of the most important customer relationship the company had ever established, at a moment when the relationship was the company's primary claim on continued existence. Musk understood this with the precise, unblinking clarity that he brought to constraints that were real and non-negotiable. He had spent 6 years building a rocket that could carry 600 kilograms to low Earth orbit. He was now committing to build a rocket that could carry 13,000 kilograms, using 9 engines clustered in a configuration that had historically been one of the most technically challenging aspects of large rocket development. The problem of making 9 engines burn simultaneously without the oscillating pressure waves in the combustion system causing them to interact destructively. A failure mode called combustion instability that had tormented Soviet and American rocket engineers throughout the 1960s. He was also committing to build the Dragon spacecraft, a vehicle that would need to rendezvous and dock with the station autonomously, withstand the thermal and structural environment of re-entry, and be recovered intact from the ocean after each mission. He was doing this with a team that had spent 6 years getting a 2-engine rocket to orbit. The step change in complexity was not incremental. There is a decision Musk made in the weeks following the CRS contract announcement that functions as a window into how his thinking had evolved since the Moscow trip, since the PayPal coup, since the 3 launch failures and the financial crisis and the compound catastrophe of 2008. He was presented, in the course of the contract negotiations and the subsequent planning discussions, with the option of approaching the Falcon 9 development conservatively, of treating the 9-engine first stage as a staged program, testing engine clusters incrementally, building up the design in a sequence that reduced technical risk at the cost of extending the timeline. He rejected this approach, not because the risk reduction was unreal, but because the timeline extension was unacceptable. The International Space Station had a resupply schedule. The schedule had been disrupted by the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster in 2003 and the grounding that followed. NASA's domestic supply chain for station resupply was constrained in ways that the agency's manifest reflected and that Musk had read carefully. The window in which SpaceX's capability was needed was not infinitely flexible, and a development program calibrated to risk reduction rather than velocity would miss the window, and missing the window would create the conditions under which the contract's value to both parties was diminished. Move fast. Accept the technical risk. Solve the problems as they arose. This was the same philosophy that had governed the Falcon 1 development, and the Falcon 1 had required 3 failures before it worked, and the Falcon 9 would require its own education in what the physics and the engineering and the manufacturing realities of a 9-engine first stage actually demanded. But the alternative, the conservative timeline, was a kind of guaranteed failure, the slow failure of arriving too late. And Musk had concluded long ago that between a fast failure you could learn from and a slow failure you couldn't, the fast failure was always the more productive choice. The figure who stands at the center of this chapter's relational architecture is Mike Griffin, the NASA administrator whose leadership had shaped the policy environment that made the CRS program possible, and whose relationship with Musk during this period illustrates the specific complexity of the partnership between private ambition and institutional authority in the American space program. Griffin had been appointed NASA administrator in 2005 by George W. Bush, and he had arrived at the job with a specific technical credibility: an aerospace engineer with advanced degrees, a veteran of programs at the Applied Physics Laboratory and the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, that gave his decisions about commercial spaceflight a weight that more purely managerial administrators might not have commanded. He had been the architect of the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program, the predecessor to CRS, that had provided SpaceX with earlier development funding, and that represented the policy framework's first significant step toward treating commercial providers as genuine partners rather than junior contractors. Griffin's endorsement of SpaceX was not unconditional. He was an engineer, and engineers assess capability against evidence, and the evidence available before Flight 4, 3 consecutive launch failures, was not compelling. The CRS award was a bet on what Flight 4 had demonstrated, rather than what the preceding 3 launches had suggested, and it was a bet that Griffin made deliberately, with the specific willingness of someone who had decided that the policy objective of developing a commercial launch capability was worth the risk of backing a provider that had not yet proven consistent success. His call to Musk after the contract announcement was brief and direct in the manner of 2 engineers conducting a professional exchange: congratulations on the achievement, acknowledgement of the contract's terms, clear articulation of the expectations that would govern the relationship going forward. There was no extended warmth, no extended celebration. There was the acknowledgement of a new phase of a relationship that would prove, over the following decade, to be one of the most consequential in the history of American space policy. Musk, for his part, treated the NASA relationship with a deference that his previous dealings with institutional authority had not always produced. The PayPal board, the Zip2 board, the Russian rocket officials, these had been adversaries, sources of friction, obstacles to the vision. NASA was something different. It was the customer, but it was also, in the specific cosmology of a man who had been reading about space since he was a boy in Pretoria, the institution that had put men on the moon, the organization whose accomplishments had helped form his understanding of what human beings were capable of, and whose flagging ambitions had helped motivate his decision to build SpaceX in the first place. The relationship was complicated by history and motivated by conviction, and Musk navigated it with a care that he did not bring to all institutional relationships. The Hawthorne facility was expanded in the weeks following the contract announcement. New engineering teams were formed. The Falcon 9 design, which had existed in drawings and simulations, moved into the hardware phase with the urgency that the contract's timeline and Musk's operational philosophy combined to produce. The Dragon spacecraft design was formalized. The manufacturing infrastructure for a vehicle class and order of magnitude more capable than the Falcon 1 began to take shape along the walls of a building that had, 6 months earlier, been preparing its last available rocket for what might have been its final launch. The company that had nearly died in 2008 was now building the company that would eventually launch humans to orbit, win contracts that would transform the economics of the entire space industry, and demonstrate, conclusively, repeatedly, against the continued skepticism of competitors who had spent 50 years telling themselves that what SpaceX was attempting was not possible, that the first principles analysis assembled on a plane ride home from Moscow had been right. What none of the engineers expanding the Hawthorne facility could see yet, as the Falcon 9 drawings were converted into metal, and the Dragon design was refined and the NASA relationship was being built on the foundation of the CRS contract, was that the success they were building toward would bring its own complications, that a company forged in deprivation and near extinction would struggle in its own specific ways with the very different pressures of success, and that the man who had kept it alive through sheer extraordinary force of will was about to discover that the skills required to build a company through crisis were not identical to the skills required to run one through growth, and that the distance between those 2 skill sets was going to matter enormously in the years ahead. Chapter 39. The Christmas Eve Deal, Saving Tesla at the Last Hour. The wire transfer needed to clear by 6 o'clock, and it was 4:15. Musk sat at a desk that had accumulated, over the preceding weeks, the physical evidence of a sustained emergency, printed term sheets with handwritten margin notes, legal documents flagged with colored tabs at the signature lines, a coffee cup that had been refilled enough times to have lost its connection to any particular morning, a phone that had been used so continuously in the preceding 72 hours that the battery had been depleted and recharged twice. Through the window, the Southern California winter light was doing what Southern California winter light does in late December, maintaining the specific, mild indifference to season that makes Christmas Eve in Los Angeles feel like a civic act of imagination rather than a meteorological reality. It was 62 degrees outside. The world was proceeding with its holiday preparations. Inside, the number on the screen was the number of hours remaining before Tesla Motors could not make payroll, and the number was single-digit. The $40 million financing round that would save the company had been in negotiation for weeks, months, if you counted the earlier versions that had collapsed when the investors who had verbally committed found reasons to withdraw, as investors will when the market environment changes fast enough to make yesterday's conviction look like last week's weather. The global financial crisis had been conducting its demolition of capital markets since September, and the demolition had been specifically brutal for companies that needed growth capital rather than rescue capital, companies that were asking investors to believe in a future rather than to prevent a present catastrophe. Tesla was asking for both simultaneously, for investors to believe in an electric vehicle future while simultaneously preventing the immediate catastrophe of a company that would cease to exist before that future could arrive if the wire transfer didn't clear by 6. The terms had been negotiated. The documents had been drafted. The commitments had been made, or made again, after the first round of commitments had unwound, or made again after that, in the specific, iterative exhaustion of a deal that kept being almost closed and then not being closed, that kept requiring one more phone call and one more revision, and one more conversation with one more investor who needed one more piece of information before they would sign. Musk had been living inside this negotiation for long enough that it had begun to have the quality of a psychological condition rather than a business process, an environment he inhabited rather than a task he was performing. He had put in the last of his own available money. This was not a rhetorical flourish or a strategic signal to other investors, though it functioned as both. It was an operational necessity. The round required his participation to close, because the other investors had made their commitments conditional on Musk's, and Musk's commitment was the load-bearing element of the structure, the thing whose presence gave the other elements permission to exist. He had borrowed it. The specifics of where exactly the money came from in those final days have been described in various ways by various sources, but the essential truth is consistent. The man who had walked away from PayPal with $180 million was, on Christmas Eve of 2008, contributing borrowed funds to a financing round in a company he had not founded to prevent a payroll from bouncing, in the middle of a global financial crisis, 3 months after his divorce had been finalized. The year 2008 had been the most comprehensively difficult year of Musk's life, and the difficulty had not been distributed evenly across its months, but had instead been front-loaded and then sustained in a way that the ordinary concept of resilience does not fully capture. The 3 SpaceX launch failures had occupied the first 8 months. The financial crisis had arrived in September. The divorce had been finalized in the same period. The NASA contract had provided a lifeline for SpaceX in December, but had done nothing for Tesla's immediate cash position, because the CRS contract funded Falcon 9 and Dragon development, and not the electric car company that was separately approaching its own terminal condition. The world against which this final crisis was unfolding had achieved, by Christmas Eve of 2008, a specific quality of collective exhaustion. The American economy had shed 500,000 jobs in November alone, the largest single-month total in 34 years. The auto industry bailout, the government loans to General Motors and Chrysler that would eventually result in managed bankruptcies and federal ownership stakes, was being finalized in congressional negotiations that were themselves conducted against the backdrop of a broader political transition. Barack Obama's incoming administration preparing to inherit an economic crisis whose dimensions were still expanding. The cultural mood was not merely pessimistic. It was, in the specific way of moments when large systems fail simultaneously, disorienting, the sense that the rules that had organized daily life were no longer reliably operative, that the assumptions underlying the ordinary economy had been revealed as contingent rather than fixed. Into this environment, Musk was attempting to close a venture capital round for an electric car company whose most prominent product had not yet been delivered at production volume, whose development program had experienced the cost overruns and timeline delays that accompany the engineering challenge of any genuinely novel technology, and whose founder was personally bankrupt in all but the formal legal sense, contributing borrowed money to the round with the specific, visible commitment of someone who has nothing left to contribute except the signal that he is still, in the fullest possible sense, in. The core conflict was not the negotiation itself, though the negotiation was genuinely difficult. It was the question of what happens to a person's capacity for clear thinking and effective action when the cumulative weight of a year like 2008 has been applied continuously and without relief, when the divorce and the launch failures and the financial crisis and the borrowed money and the sleepless negotiations have been operating simultaneously on a single human nervous system for months. Most people under this load would have experienced a degradation in the quality of their judgment, the specific measurable impairment that sleep deprivation and chronic stress produce in the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive systems responsible for risk assessment and decision-making. The evidence suggests that Musk, in December of 2008, was operating in this state, and was doing so at a level of functional effectiveness that his colleagues found difficult to fully explain. The explanation, to the extent one exists, may be the same explanation that accounts for his performance under every extreme circumstance his career had produced: the specific, constitutional inability to separate his identity from the work, which meant that the work was not an additional burden being borne by a person who had other things to sustain. The work was what sustained him. Tesla surviving was not a professional goal he was pursuing in addition to his personal life. It was, in the full sense of the phrase, a reason for being. There is a specific detail from the final hours of the Christmas Eve closing that has been preserved by the lawyers and Tesla employees who were managing the transaction mechanics, and it illuminates something about Musk's operational character at the exact moment of maximum pressure that more composed circumstances do not produce. As the closing documents were being executed and the wire transfer instructions were being coordinated, one of the term sheets contained a provision that Musk considered unfavorable. Not catastrophically unfavorable, not a term that would undermine the company's long-term interests in a material way, but unfavorable in the specific, pointed way that terms inserted late in a closing process are sometimes inserted by counterparties who have calculated that the deadline creates leverage. Musk pushed back. Not by withdrawing from the negotiation, not by threatening to walk away from a closing that he needed to happen in the next 90 minutes, but by identifying the provision precisely, articulating why it was unacceptable, and proposing an alternative formulation that addressed the counterparty's underlying interest without the objectionable structure. He did this calmly, in the specific register of someone who has decided that maintaining clarity about what is and is not acceptable is a more effective negotiating posture than desperation, even when desperation would have been the understandable response. The provision was revised. The closing continued. This moment, negotiating a contract term at 4:30 on Christmas Eve with the payroll deadline 2 hours away, is the keyhole into Musk's character during this period. It reveals that the pressure which had been applied at a level that would have produced in most people either capitulation or breakdown had produced in him something different: a compressed, focused clarity about what mattered and what didn't, a triage of priorities so refined by necessity that the ordinarily difficult task of holding a firm position in a desperate negotiation had been simplified by the extremity of the circumstances into the only available response. He was not brave exactly. He was past the point where bravery required conscious effort. He was operating on the specific autopilot of someone whose options had been reduced to a number small enough to manage without the overhead of deliberation. The figure whose relationship with Musk most clarifies the texture of the Christmas Eve closing is Antonio Gracias, a private equity investor who had backed Tesla in earlier rounds and who was among the investors in the final December financing. Gracias had been in Musk's orbit since the mid-2000s and had developed, across a series of transactions and the particular form of insight that watching someone operate under sustained adversity produces, a conviction about Musk's character that went beyond ordinary investor confidence in a founder. Gracias had watched Musk navigate the 2008 crisis from a position of genuine proximity, close enough to see not just the decisions but the process behind the decisions, the way Musk maintained the distinction between what was negotiable and what was not, the way he managed his own distress without allowing it to become visible in the interactions that required his performance to be at its best. What Gracias observed, and what he has described in subsequent interviews with a specificity that carries the weight of direct experience, was not the absence of strain but the specific, disciplined management of it, the way Musk had learned through years of operating at the edge of what was survivable, to treat his own emotional state as a variable to be managed rather than a condition to be expressed. The wire transfer cleared at 5:58 p.m. 2 minutes before the deadline. The $40 million round was closed. Tesla's payroll would clear. The company that had been hours from bankruptcy on December 24, 2008, would survive into the new year. And the new year would bring challenges different in character, but equal in consequence from the ones that 2008 had produced. The challenge of delivering the Roadster at volume, the challenge of developing the Model S while the Roadster program was still consuming resources, the challenge of managing a company through growth after having managed it through near death, and the challenge of doing all of this as the CEO who had not been Tesla's original founder but who had become, through the specific, total, and costly commitment of 2008, the only person whose identity was now fully and irrevocably fused with the company's survival. Musk called his assistant after the wire confirmed. He called Tesla's CFO. He called a small number of people who had been inside the crisis with him and who needed to know that the crisis had, for the moment, resolved. The calls were brief, factual, without extended celebration. The specific, flat affect of someone who has been operating at emergency intensity for long enough that the resolution of the emergency does not produce euphoria but simply a slight decrease in the pressure, a small and temporary loosening of the grip. Then he went home to his children, whose Christmas had been proceeding independently of the financing round, as children's Christmases do, requiring the presence of a father who had been somewhere else for most of the preceding month in ways that were invisible to them because they were 6 and 4 and 3 years old and their world was gifts and family and the specific uncomplicated demand of small humans who need their father to be present and do not fully understand that his presence on this particular Christmas Eve was itself the most unlikely gift that 2008 had produced. The year was not over. The divorce settlement was not finalized. The Falcon 9 development program had barely begun. The Model S existed as a concept and a fundraising promise and not much else. The NASA contract was funded but unexecuted. The next phase of what Musk was building had barely been sketched, and the sketches raised questions that the answers available in December of 2008 could not resolve. But Tesla was alive, and SpaceX was alive, and the man who had built them both was alive, and the specific, extraordinary improbability of all three of those facts being simultaneously true on Christmas Eve of 2008, given everything that the year had deployed against all three, was a thing that Musk would carry forward into the decade that followed, not as sentiment, but as the data point that had most conclusively established the one variable that all his subsequent decisions would be built upon. He now knew, in the most empirical sense available, exactly how much he could endure, and the knowledge was going to cost his competitors more than they were yet prepared to pay. Chapter 40. The transition to dual CEO. The org chart had 2 boxes at the top now, and both of them had his name in them. Musk studied it in the way he studied most things that arrived as administrative artifacts, not with the attention he gave to engineering documents or financial models, but with the specific, evaluative glance of someone determining whether the thing in front of him accurately reflected the reality it purported to describe. The reality it purported to describe was this: he was now the chief executive officer of 2 companies simultaneously, one building rockets in Hawthorne, and one building electric cars in San Carlos, both of which had recently survived the kind of near-death experience that most companies do not survive, both of which had significant contractual obligations and development programs and workforces depending on coherent leadership, and both of which were now, in the specific organizational sense, his. He had been Tesla's chairman since 2004, the largest investor, the most visible external presence, the person who had saved the company with borrowed money on Christmas Eve. The formal title of CEO which he assumed in October 2008 following the departure of Z.F. Drora, who had himself replaced Martin Eberhard the previous year, was in one sense merely the official recognition of a role he had been performing operationally for months. In another sense, it was the most significant governance decision of his professional life since the PayPal coup, the moment at which he had drawn the lesson from being removed from his own company and built the structure that ensured it could not happen the same way again. He had the votes at Tesla. He had the votes at SpaceX. Both of those facts had been true, in various forms, before October 2008. What was new was the formality, the legal and organizational acknowledgement that the person responsible for both companies' strategic direction was the same person, and that the same person intended to remain responsible, and that the governance structure of both organizations had been arranged to make that intention durable against the kinds of institutional pressures that had made it non-durable at Zip2 and at PayPal. The lesson of the PayPal coup had taken 8 years to fully install. The world that Musk was entering as dual CEO in late 2008 was one organized around a crisis that had not yet resolved. The global financial catastrophe was still unfolding, still claiming institutional victims, still reshaping the assumptions about capitalism and risk and institutional stability that had governed the previous 2 decades of American economic life. Barack Obama would be inaugurated in January, inheriting an economy that was shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs per month, and a financial system that had been stabilized by intervention but not restored by it. The new administration's economic team was focused on the stimulus legislation that would become the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a program that would ultimately include significant investments in clean energy technology, investments that would prove consequential for Tesla in ways that were not yet visible in December of 2008, but that the policy environment was beginning to make probable. The cultural moment carried a specific receptivity to the narrative that Musk was living. The financial crisis had produced, alongside its economic destruction, a profound skepticism about the institutions that had claimed responsibility for managing the complexity of modern capitalism. The banks, the rating agencies, the regulators, the theoretical frameworks that had been used to justify the risk structures that had failed so spectacularly. Into this skepticism, the story of a man who had built 2 companies in the physical economy, not financial instruments, not derivatives, but actual rockets and actual cars, and had done so against the active resistance of established industries, and through personal adversity of a magnitude that the financial crisis was making newly legible to people who had not previously had cause to think about what it cost to build something real, carried a resonance that his earlier biography had not produced. Musk was not yet the celebrity he would become. He was not yet the public figure whose every statement generated global commentary, whose romantic life was tabloid material, whose Twitter presence would eventually consume and reshape the company that owned it. He was, in late 2008, a name known in technology and aerospace and automotive circles, a figure who had achieved the specific kind of recognition that attaches to someone who has done something difficult and consequential in industries that care about difficult and consequential things. The broader public was only beginning to learn who he was, and what they were learning was the version of him that the crisis had forged, the man who had survived 2008 with 2 companies intact, and this version was, for the purposes of the narrative that would grow around him, a remarkably effective foundation. The core conflict of the dual CEO transition was not the governance structure which Musk had resolved. It was the operational question that the governance structure could not resolve by itself. How does a single human being provide genuine, functional leadership to 2 companies simultaneously, each of which is attempting something that would fully occupy most leaders' complete attention, in industries that are sufficiently different in their technical requirements, their regulatory environments, their manufacturing challenges, and their customer relationships that the expertise required to lead each one is itself a full-time intellectual commitment? The question was not rhetorical. It was practical, and it had a practical answer, and the answer was one that most management theorists and most experienced executives would have assessed as inadequate. Musk did it by treating both roles as expressions of a single underlying mission, by refusing to acknowledge that the cognitive demands of the 2 positions were competitive with each other, and by organizing his time with the specific, systematic ruthlessness of someone who has decided that the scarcest resource in his life is not money but attention, and that attention must be allocated according to a hierarchy of urgency and importance that is reviewed and revised constantly. He developed, in this period, the practice that would define his operational method for the following decade, the week split. He spent the beginning of the week at SpaceX, the latter part at Tesla, and he commuted between them with the regularity of a schedule that made the commute not a burden but a structural feature, the physical movement between two worlds serving as a kind of cognitive reset, the transition time used for the reading and the calls and the thinking that neither company's office environment easily accommodated. The schedule was not flexible. The meetings were not allowed to expand to fill the available time, because the available time was definitionally insufficient, and any expansion in one direction was a contraction in the other. There is a specific episode from the early months of the dual CEO arrangement that illuminates this operational philosophy with a precision that abstract description cannot match. A senior Tesla engineer had scheduled a 2-hour review meeting for a development question that required Musk's decision, a battery management system issue that had implications for the Roadster's performance specifications, and that the engineering team had determined needed the CEO's input to resolve. The meeting was on a Thursday, a day when Musk's schedule designated SpaceX as the primary obligation. He appeared at the Tesla meeting 45 minutes late, reviewed the materials that had been prepared, asked 12 questions of the kind that revealed he had read the background documents on the flight from Hawthorne, reached a decision in the 13th minute of his actual presence, and left. The engineer who had scheduled the meeting told the story afterward with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. Frustration because the 2-hour block had been allocated and only 45 minutes of it had been used. Admiration because the decision that had emerged from those 45 minutes was technically correct and had resolved the issue in a way that 3 days of prior engineering discussion had not. The meeting had been long enough for the decision. Musk had determined how long the meeting needed to be and attended for that duration. The gap between the allocated time and the used time was, in his accounting, not rudeness but efficiency, and efficiency was the resource that the dual CEO arrangement required above all others. The figure whose relationship with Musk most directly shaped the viability of the dual CEO arrangement during this period was Gwynne Shotwell, whose role at SpaceX had evolved by late 2008 from Vice President of Business Development to the operational leadership position that would eventually be formalized as President and Chief Operating Officer. The evolution had been driven by necessity, the complexity of the CRS contract, the scale of the Falcon 9 development program, and the simple arithmetic of a CEO who was now splitting his time between two companies required a SpaceX leader who could manage the company's day-to-day operations with the full authority that operational leadership requires, rather than waiting for decisions to be routed through a CEO who was physically present only part of each week. Shotwell had been performing elements of this role for years, managing the customer relationships and the business development operations with the autonomy that Musk had granted her in recognition of her judgment and her specific understanding of the industry. What expanded in late 2008 was the scope, the engineering decisions that now flowed through her when Musk was at Tesla, the program management authority that was consolidated under her oversight as the Falcon 9 development ramped up, the organizational leadership that a company growing from a few hundred employees toward the workforce scale the Falcon 9 program required, needed to have embedded in its daily operations rather than concentrated in a founder who was dividing his presence between two locations. The relationship between them had developed the specific quality of a functional partnership that does not require extensive communication to maintain, the kind of professional alignment that exists between two people who have worked through enough crises together that their models of each other's priorities are accurate enough to make constant coordination unnecessary. Shotwell knew what Musk wanted from SpaceX because she had watched him want it for 6 years. He trusted her operational judgment because she had demonstrated it consistently, including under the specific pressure of the 2008 crisis when the company's customer relationships had needed maintenance through 3 consecutive launch failures, and the financial uncertainty of a founder who was simultaneously trying to save Tesla. The Tesla side of the dual arrangement was, in its own way, more personally exposed. Musk was newer to the CEO role there. The product was in a more critical development phase, and the engineering challenges that the Roadster program had been encountering were of a kind that required not just strategic oversight, but the specific, detailed technical engagement that he provided most naturally when he was physically present. The Model S, which would be Tesla's second vehicle, and which needed to be designed, engineered, and brought to production while the Roadster program was still consuming resources, was in its earliest concept phase in late 2008. A vehicle that existed as an intention and some preliminary sketches and the conviction that the company's survival required a car that could reach a much larger market than the Roadster's six-figure price point permitted. Musk made himself available to the Model S design team with a regularity that the dual CEO schedule made genuinely costly. Hours at Tesla were hours not at SpaceX, and the accounting was always in deficit, and the deficit was managed through the same ruthless triage of attention that governed everything else. He reviewed design proposals with the specific intensity of someone who had been thinking about what a mass-market electric car needed to look like and function like since before Tesla existed as a company, and who had formed opinions sufficiently detailed and sufficiently non-negotiable that the design reviews were not exercises in consensus building but in translation, translating what he had decided into the engineering specifications that the team could execute. This was not comfortable leadership, in the sense that comfort was not a variable the approach was optimized for. It was effective leadership, in the sense that the decisions were reached and the standards were maintained, and the companies were moving in directions that were, in both cases, toward the outcomes that the missions required. Whether the people being led found it sustainable over time was a question that 2008 had not yet required the dual CEO arrangement to answer. The crisis had made endurance feel like the only available option, and endurance has a way of resolving the comfort question by making comfort seem beside the point. The year that had nearly destroyed everything was ending, and the man who had survived it was entering the new year with a governance structure, an operational method, a NASA contract, a closed financing round, and a developing conviction, formed in the specific crucible of 2008, where the worst had happened and had been survived, that the thing which distinguishes the people who build enduring enterprises from the people who merely attempt them is not intelligence or vision or even the willingness to work at a pace that the human system was not designed to sustain, but something simpler and rarer and more fundamental: the refusal, maintained against evidence that would break most people, to accept that the thing is over when the thing is not yet over. He had refused, and it had worked, and the working of it was now the foundation of everything that was coming. The Falcon 9 and the Dragon and the Model S and the Solar City and the Hyperloop and the Boring Company and the neural interfaces and the social media empire and all the other expressions of a mind that had been tested to its absolute limit in 2008 and had emerged from the testing, not chastened but accelerated, carrying forward into a decade of extraordinary ambition the specific dangerous knowledge that he could survive anything, and that the knowledge was not a comfort but a permission, and that the things he was about to attempt with that permission were going to reshape the world in ways that the people who had tried to stop him had not yet begun to imagine.